sans serif, which are these two over here. So at the moment, this class isn't actually doing anything new. However, for a component like a button, it is good practice to explicitly define these properties so you have easy reference in your CSS. And secondly, in the box model topic, we will be adding new properties in here which don't currently exist in the CSS. So we definitely do need this btn structural class. But I did just want to highlight that currently it is actually doing nothing new, because all of these properties are already defined on our anchor tag over here and over here. All we're doing is using a class, btn, to override the default anchor tag styling. But it's just a bit funny at the moment because we're overriding it with its existing styles. But as I mentioned, we will be adding new styles in the box model topic.
Next up, we'll dive into styling elements based on their state by using pseudo-classes.
We'll be discussing what are pseudo-classes, state pseudo-classes, and conditional pseudo-classes.
So what are pseudo-classes? Pseudo-classes define styles for a specific state or condition of an HTML element. So what do we mean by state or condition? Let's look at state first. An example of a state of an HTML element would be something like a button. At the moment, the button is green, but if I were to hover over this button, it turns purple. This is an example of state, where we can define styles for different states. Like we saw the button was green when our cursor was not hovering over it, whereas it turned purple when we did hover over it. Let's now look at condition. This would be something like in a table. We could style every odd row to be purple, like rows 1 and 3 here, and every even row to be white, like rows 2 and 4 here. We're using a condition of odd and even numbers to style the table. So let's now have a look at how we write pseudo-classes in CSS. A pseudo-class is a keyword with a colon added to the end of a selector. Let's have a look at an example of an anchor tag. We're using the type selector here to select all anchor tags. We then add a colon and add the specific pseudo-class name, in this case hover. This combination of colon and pseudo-class name gives us a pseudo-class. So let's first take a look at the state pseudo-classes. These pseudo-classes are very important. So state pseudo-classes are about dynamic styling based on user interaction and commonly used for hyperlinks. Now I know the term pseudo-class can seem intimidating, but honestly, the most common use case for them is for hyperlinks, and we're going to be spending some time on it now. So don't freak out, just stick with me. There are 4 different pseudo-classes we can apply to our hyperlinks. The first is the link pseudo-class. This targets anchor tags that have not yet been visited. So in other words, it's simply an anchor tag you haven't clicked yet. The next pseudo-class is the visited pseudo-class. This targets anchor tags that have been visited. You've probably had an experience with this already, where oftentimes a link you've previously clicked on that you revisit will now be purple. This happens in Google searches all the time. So the visited pseudo-class will target anchor tags that you have visited, and the link pseudo-class targets anchor tags that haven't yet been clicked. Now these 2 pseudo-classes are specific to anchor tags. You can't use them anywhere else. The next pseudo-class is the hover pseudo-class. This targets an element when the cursor is placed over it. It's like what we saw in the start, how the button turned from green to purple. That would be using a hover pseudo-class. The last pseudo-class is the active pseudo-class. This targets an element when it is being clicked. So this pseudo-class is specifically targeting when the element is actually being clicked. Oftentimes, you won't even notice the active pseudo-class, because clicking an element might only last a few milliseconds. These 2 pseudo-classes are not specific to anchor tags. You can use them on other elements. So let's go play around with these in VS Code. So in VS Code, I've created a new folder called pseudo-class. I've added an index.html with the HTML boilerplate, and I've linked a style sheet called app.css. In the index.html, let's go add an anchor tag. We'll give it the anchor text, click here. And for the href attribute, I'm just going to point it to Google's homepage. Jumping into the app.css file, we're going to style the anchor tag with those 4 different pseudo-classes. Let's first do the link pseudo-class. This pseudo-class was about when the anchor tag had not yet been visited. Let's give this a color of blue. Next up, we'll do the visited pseudo class. This styles the anchor tag once it has been visited. Let's give it a color of red. The next pseudo class was the hover pseudo class. This will style the anchor tag when the cursor is placed over it. Let's give it a color of green. And the final pseudo class was the active pseudo class, and this targets the element when it is being clicked. Let's give this a color of yellow. Alright, let's go play around with this in the browser. Alright, I'm on the index.html file and I've zoomed in quite a bit, just so we can see what's going on. You can see straight away the hyperlink is blue. That's this style here. It's an anchor tag we have not yet clicked. If I now hover over it, you can see it turns green, and that's the hover pseudo class coming into play. I'm now going to click on it, but I'm not going to let go of my mouse, because I want you to see the active pseudo class in play. So right now I'm holding my mouse down, but I'm not letting go. And you can see the active pseudo class, yellow, is coming into play. I'm now going to let go, so it clicks the link. Okay, so we've now clicked the link. Let's head back to the page. So now you can see the link is no longer blue, it's red. And that's because I've clicked the link. So this pseudo class is coming into play, visited. So let's now look at some state pseudo class guidance. It is best practice to style the pseudo classes of anchor tags instead of styling the anchor element directly. So let's have a look at what I mean by first looking at what is considered bad practice. Bad practice is simply using the type selector to select the anchor tag and apply styles directly. This is considered bad practice because we're not styling the different states the anchor tags can be. On the other hand, good practice is styling all the different pseudo classes for the anchor tag. This approach covers all states. So our CSS would look something like this. We'd first style the linked and visited pseudo class, for example, with the color blue. And you'll note these are actually grouped together, which is very common. It's because it isn't that common to separately style your visited pseudo class. You usually want it to adopt the same styling as just the regular link. So that's why we group these together. We then add styling rules for the hover and active pseudo classes. For example, we'll give it the color dark blue. And again, you'll notice these are grouped. And that's because we often don't really care about the subtlety of the active state, because in practice, you only see it for a few milliseconds when you click the link. So we just want to style it the same as the hover state, and that's why we group them together. This structure of styling the link and visited pseudo classes together and the hover and active pseudo classes together is incredibly common. And we take this same approach when styling a button class. For example, this would be considered bad practice, just styling the button, whereas this would be considered good practice, styling the button class pseudo class of link, visited, hover, and active. Now that can seem like a bit of a mouthful. We're targeting the pseudo class of a class, but it is common and don't let it intimidate you. At the end of the day, our BTN class is targeting an anchor tag. So don't let the pseudo class on a class thing throw you off. We're just targeting an anchor tag with the class name BTN.
We will be implementing this approach to pseudo classes on our buttons in the Quill project. So stick with me and we'll soon see this in practice.
Let's have a quick look at conditional pseudo classes. Conditional pseudo classes are generally less important. I'm not really going to be using them at all in the bootcamp, but I just want to show you that they exist and how they work. Conditional pseudo classes are styling based on an element's position in relation to other elements. For example, we could have the pseudo class firstChild, which targets the first child element in a list. We have the lastChild pseudo class, which targets the last child element. And there's also the nthChild pseudo class, which targets child elements based on their position. In this case, every nth child. Now, some common places you may see conditional pseudo classes include on lists, like I've done here, or in tables, where you'd be targeting the TR element, the table row. For example, to get alternating colors for table rows, which helps with table readability. Let's jump into VS Code and play around with these conditional pseudo classes. I'm back in the pseudo class folder over here, and I've cleared out the index.html file and our app.css file from when we were playing around with state pseudo classes. In index.html, I'm going to go add an unordered list. I'm going to create 6 list items by typing li times 6. And I'm just going to give each list item a number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Jumping over to our app.css file, let's grab a list item and select the first child pseudo class. And let's make it the color red. So this will style our first list item red. Let's then grab the list element again and add the last child pseudo class. Let's give this a color of blue. Let's check this out in the browser. Okay, I'm just going to zoom in a bit so we can see this more clearly. You can see that our first list item is now red and our last list item is blue. So if I now were to go add another list item, let's say the number 7, you'll see that the blue color is now applied to 7. It's always targeting the last child of the list. And the same thing here, if I go add the number 0 and refresh, you'll see that the first child is always targeting the first list item, which is now 0. I'm going to remove these styles. Let's now play around with the nth child pseudo class. The way this works is we need to specify something inside these brackets. For now, I'm just going to pick the number 3, and this will simply target the third element. Let's go and give that a color of green, and I'll refresh the browser, and you'll see the third list item, which is now number 2, is green. But we can use this as a bit of a formula, where, for example, I can put 2n, which will target every second list item as green. So if I refresh, you'll see 1, 3, 5, and 7, which is every second list item is now green. In other words, I'm targeting even list items. I can target odd elements by simply adding a +1 here, so that when n is 0, 2 times 0 is 0 plus 1, so the first item will be green. When n is 1, 2 times 1 is 2, plus 1 is 3, so every third item will be green. When n is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5, so every fifth item will be green, etc. So if I refresh,
So you'll now see that every odd list item,
starting here, is styled green. And not that you'd ever need to do this, but you can start making up your own linear equations in here. For example, I could do 3n plus 2. So if I refresh, when n is 0, we get 3 times 0 plus 2, so the second list item is styled. When n is 1, 3 times 1 is 3, plus 2 is 5, so the fifth list item is green. Anyways, I just wanted to show you these conditional pseudo classes. Don't let them freak you out. We're not really going to be using them at all. The state pseudo classes on our anchor tags are way more important.
So let's finish off by starting to build the next summary card, pseudo classes and specificity.
we looked at pseudo classes. A pseudo class works by having a selector, like the anchor tag, and following it with a colon and a pseudo class name, like hover. This gives us a pseudo class. We saw that there were two different types of pseudo classes. There was a state pseudo class, which is very important, and this is where styling is based on user interaction. And we saw a common use case was targeting anchor tags, like buttons, where we would often group the link and visited pseudo classes, as well as group the hover and active pseudo classes. We then also looked at conditional pseudo classes, and these were less important, as we don't use them as often as state pseudo classes. Conditional pseudo classes is when styling is based on an element's relative position. And we saw an example of an nth child pseudo class and can be used to target every odd or even list row.
So let's go and add pseudo classes to our Quill project.
Now, the first thing we need to talk about is where exactly are we going to add these pseudo classes? We actually don't need to add the pseudo classes onto this button class here. And that's because it's setting up the overall structure of the button. We only really care about the state changes of the button, like when you're hovering or when it's visited, for the actual specific button styles. So button primary and button secondary. So let's do the first group of pseudo classes. We'll do button primary and add the pseudo class link, which again targets anchor tags that have not yet been visited. And we're going to be grouping that with button primary and the pseudo class visited, which, as a reminder, targets anchor tags that have been visited. We'll grab our curly bracket and we'll just give this the same color as before. And I'm now going to get rid of this style here as we don't need it anymore, as we're now implementing better practice, targeting all 4 states of our button. We'll then add the next group of pseudo classes. So we'll grab our class btn-primary and the pseudo class hover, which as a reminder targets the anchor tag when the cursor is hovering over it. And we'll group this with button primary and the active pseudo class, which as a reminder targets an element when it is being clicked. We'll grab our curly brackets and let's now add a darker color of this blue. We'll scroll up to the UI guide we created at the top. And let's add our primary shade, this deep sea color here. And we'll go ahead and implement this exact same method for our secondary button. We'll grab our secondary button, add the link pseudo class, grab the secondary button and add the visited pseudo class, grab curly brackets, and we'll use the same color here. We'll then get rid of this as we no longer need it. We'll then add the other group of pseudo classes. We'll grab button secondary, add the hover pseudo class, get button secondary again, and grab the active pseudo class. For the color here, let's go grab a shade of this purple. Scrolling up to the top, this purple is lavender, it's our secondary base color. For the shade, we called it Velvet Night. And it has this hex code here, so I'll simply copy that and paste it here as the color value. So let's now check this out in the browser. So our get started anchor tag here has the btn primary style applied to it. Just as a reminder, if I head to index.html, you can see here this anchor tag has the class btn and btn primary. So with our pseudo classes, we've now targeted this primary button and considered all the different states. At the moment, the get started button is this blue here because it's a link which hasn't yet been clicked. If I hover over it, you'll notice that it goes a darker blue. And that's this pseudo class coming into play. The hover pseudo class is making it this slightly darker blue. I'm now going to click on it but hold my mouse to show you the active pseudo class. I am holding my mouse and you won't actually notice a change in color. And that's because the hover pseudo class is grouped together with our active pseudo class. It's the same darker blue. I'm now going to let go of my mouse so that the anchor tag is clicked, which takes me to the register page. I'm just going to head back, and the get started hyperlink is still our primary base blue. That is this blue over here. It hasn't changed color because the visited pseudo class is the same as the link pseudo class. And the exact same thing would happen down here, on this get started button here. As a reminder, we've added the btn secondary class there. Looking in the index.html, scrolling down to the CTA section, you can see btn and btn secondary. So the exact same thing is going to happen now. The hyperlink text is our base purple, whether it's been visited or not. And when I hover and click, it's going to go to that darker shade of purple, which you can see now. Now, just to clarify again, why we're adding our pseudo classes over here and not to the btn class over here, is that because the state changes that we're going to be coding are only happening on our primary and secondary. There are no changes in state to any of these properties. It's not like when I hover over the button, I'm changing the font or changing the font size. These properties are static. They remain constant no matter what the state is. However, for the specific styling like primary and secondary buttons, we do want to consider state. We want to make our buttons one color in this state and another color in this state. And in the CSS box model topic coming up soon, we're going to be adding even more properties in here. Things like background color, which will really make these two groups of pseudo classes even more prominent. Now, one last thing I want to show you before we finish up is I could take a similar approach with this anchor tag here. I could add in pseudo classes just like we did for the link and visited state, as well as the hover and active state. Those styles would be visible down here in this mini navigation bar in our footer. So for example, we could style the anchor tag that when I hover on it, it goes a little bit darker. Now, I'm not going to do that because I want to keep this a bit simpler for now. That style really is not critical for the visual aesthetic of this web page. But for buttons, it is. You always want to be using pseudo classes on your buttons like I've done here.
Let's continue by exploring to select elements based on their relationship with other elements using combinator selectors.
We'll be talking about the descendant selector, the direct descendant selector, the adjacent sibling selector, and the general sibling selector. So what are combinator selectors? Combinator selectors combines two or more selectors to target elements based on their position relative to each other. Now, I do want to give a bit of a heads up at this point. The combinator selectors we're going to look at are just not that commonly used in CSS.
This chapter may seem overwhelming going through each of these selectors,
But I honestly wouldn't worry about it too much. It's something you just need to know about and probably aren't going to be using them that much in practice. There's four main types of combinator selectors. The first is called the descendant or child selector and looks like this. And this selector I do sometimes use. It's definitely the more commonly used one compared to the others we'll look at. The next combinator selector is the direct descendant or child selector and looks like this. The next one is the adjacent sibling selector, which looks like this. And the last one is the general sibling selector, which looks like this. Now, these three I don't really use, and they're not overly common. So as you can see, each of these selectors is combining two selectors, and we're going to go through each one now to see how they work. We'll start off with the descendant selector. This targets all children elements of a parent. We have a selector, then a space, followed by another selector. In this case, div space p. Let's have a look at a snippet of HTML to see how this works. This HTML is a short article of my favorite Will Smith movies. We've got a containing div element with the class of article, and inside the div we have an h1, 2 paragraphs, and then another div which contains an unordered list and a paragraph. So let's look at a CSS rule and see the descendant selector in action. This first class, article, we would call the parent, and the paragraph type selector is the child. So inside our HTML, the class article is on this div, which is the parent, and the paragraph here and here are what we call direct children. They're direct children of the parent. We also have a paragraph down the bottom here inside the nested div. This would be considered a grandchild. Now the descendant selector targets all children element of the parent. So all three paragraphs here would be blue. Now just a small note, we can use any type of selectors. In the example I showed you, we used a class selector, which was the parent, followed by a type selector, which was the child. But we can use any selectors. For example, we could achieve the same thing by two type selectives, div, which would be the parent, and the paragraph type selector, which again would be the child. So you can use any selector types. The important thing to note is that the first selector you choose is the parent, followed by a space, followed by the second selector, which will be the child. So let's have a play around with this in VS Code. I've prepared a new file, index.html, which contains the HTML snippet we just saw before, an article containing my favorite Will Smith movies. I've also linked a style sheet, which is currently empty. So let's go use the descendant selector. I'll first use the class article, which is the parent element, space, and then paragraph for my child element. Let's give it the color green and a font size of 30 pixels. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see that all paragraphs, whether they're a child, grandchild, etc., of the parent container are all green. We know that these two paragraphs were direct children, which are over here in our HTML, and this paragraph was a grandchild. It's the child of a child, but the descendant selector selects all children. Next up is the direct descendant selector. This targets only direct children elements of a parent. And the syntax looks like this, where instead of a space, we have a right angle bracket. So looking at some CSS now, we'd write a rule very similar to before, but instead of a space, we now have a right angle bracket. The class article, again, is the parent, and the paragraph type selector is the child. Now the direct descendant selector, like its name suggests, only targets direct descendants. So this paragraph down here is a grandchild, which is not selected. So only the direct children, shown in green, would be colored blue. Let's play around with this in VS Code. Back inside our app.css file, I'm going to change the descendant selector to a direct descendant selector by using the right angle bracket.
and I'll just keep these styles the same. Let's check this out in the browser. So now you can see only these two paragraphs are being styled, and this paragraph down here is not being styled because it's not a direct descendant. It's what we would call a grandchild. Next up is the adjacent sibling selector. Adjacent is just a fancy word for next to. The adjacent sibling selector targets an element directly after another element, both nested within the same parent. The syntax looks like this, where the parent and child are now separated by a plus symbol. Now the sentence I read out before is a bit of a mouthful, so let's see what this actually means. Inside our CSS, we could have a rule like this, where we have two selectors separated by a plus. The first selector we call the preceding sibling, i.e. the sibling before. And the second selector we call the adjacent sibling, that is, the sibling next to. So I'm going to read out the sentence again. Targets an element directly after another element both nested within the same parent. Let's start with both nested within the same parent. That would be something like this div element here. It's a shared parent of nested elements. Now in our CSS, the first selector is the h1, which is the preceding selector. In our markup, the h1 is over here. So this is the preceding sibling. And the adjacent sibling is the element directly after the preceding sibling. So it's just this paragraph here. It's the adjacent sibling. So the important part here is that the two elements we're selecting, the h1 and paragraph, need to be nested within the same parent, in this case the div. And because they're on the same level, they're considered siblings. Where we first select the preceding sibling, it's kind of like the root sibling. It's our reference point. And the next selector is the adjacent sibling, and it's specifically targeting the element directly after the preceding sibling. So that's why only the first paragraph is selected, and not the paragraph below it. Let's play around with this in VS Code. So I'm going to get rid of this style from before. I'll grab the h1 plus the paragraph and our curly brackets. And for this style, let's just give it a color of red. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see here the adjacent sibling, which is the paragraph, has been colored red. Like I mentioned, see the h1 as like a reference point, which is over here in our markup. The adjacent sibling selector targets the element directly after this reference point, this paragraph here. And again, for this to work, they have to be considered siblings, which means they need a shared parent, which in this case is this div over here. The last combinator selector we're going to look at is the general sibling selector. This targets multiple elements directly after another element, both nested within the same parent. And the syntax looks like this, where we have two selectors separated by a tilde symbol. So let's have a look at this inside CSS. I'm going to define this rule here. The h1 is again considered the preceding sibling, and the paragraph is now referred to as subsequent siblings. The general sibling selector is pretty similar to the adjacent sibling selector. In addition to selecting direct siblings, it will select multiple siblings that are nested within the same parent. So this paragraph over here is also selected. The first and second paragraph are both subsequent siblings of the heading. The paragraph down here is not a sibling of the heading, so won't be selected. Let's look at this inside VS Code. So all I'm going to do is remove the plus symbol and replace it with a tilde, and I'll keep the style the same. So let's check it out in the browser. So you can see now, both this paragraph and this paragraph are styled red, whereas before, with the adjacent sibling selector, only this paragraph was styled red. And we can also see that this paragraph is not styled. Now, all these combinator selectors are pretty intimidating. As I mentioned, don't really worry about them. And besides the descendant selector, which is definitely the easiest one to understand, I'm not really going to be using these throughout the bootcamp. But I just want you to know about them in case you see them out there in the wild.
So let's wrap up by adding to our summary card pseudo-classes and specificity.
We looked at combinator selectors. We saw there were 4 different kinds of combinator selectors. We had the descendant selector, where we used 2 selectors separated by a space. We had the direct descendant selector, where we have 2 selectors separated by a right angle bracket. We have the adjacent sibling selector, where we have 2 selectors separated by a plus symbol.
And we had the general sibling selector,
where we have 2 selectors separated by a tilde symbol.
As I've mentioned a few times now, I know these combinator selectors are quite overwhelming, and the good news is we don't really use them. So I wouldn't worry too much about them. I would just remember what the descendant selector does, as you will sometimes want to use that.
Now it's time to look at how CSS determines which styles take precedence through the concept of specificity. We'll be discussing the cascade and conflicting selectors, specificity, and specificity calculations. Before we look at specificity, let's do a quick recap of the cascade. The cascade is about how styles declared later will take priority when the selectors are the same. For example, looking at this snippet of HTML, we have an H1. In CSS, we could style the selector by using the type selector to grab the H1 and then give it a color of blue. Later on in the sheet, we can grab the H1 again using the type selector. So in this example, we're using the same selector, the H1 type selector. And we know because of the cascading nature of CSS, styles declared later will take priority. So in this case, green overrides blue. So the H1 will no longer be styled blue, it will be styled green. Let's now talk about what happens when we have conflicting selectors. When styles are applied to the same element using a different type of selector, the outcome is determined by specificity. So what do we mean by this? Let's say we had the same HTML we saw before, but now we've added a class attribute with the value heading. Now in the CSS, we're going to style this heading in two different ways. The first is using the class heading, where we have the notation period or full stop, followed by heading. And the second is using the type selector H1. So now in this case, we have different selectors, a class selector and a type selector, but they're both targeting the same H1 element. And not only are they targeting the same element, they're applying conflicting styles. The class selector is styling the heading to be blue, whereas the type selector is styling the heading to be green. Now up until this point, you would say to me that because the type selector H1 with the color green is declared after the class selector, the color of the heading will be green, because we know the nature of the cascade is that styles declared later will take priority. However, this is not the case. The green does not override the blue. And this is where specificity comes into play. Now, to understand specificity, we're going to be looking at sports tables. In a sports table, team rankings are determined using a system of priority. I'm going to be looking at the English Premier League. Currently, Arsenal is in first place, Man City in second place, and Liverpool in third place. The rankings of the teams are determined by things like wins, draws, and goal difference, where as we move from the left to the right, the numbers have a lower priority, where as we know a win is more substantial than a draw, and a draw is more substantial than goal difference. We can see Arsenal has 7 wins. This puts them in first place as they have the most wins. Looking now at Man City and Liverpool, they both have the same number of wins, 5 each, and they also have the same number of draws, 4 each. So the place in the table is determined by goal difference. Man City has 20 and Liverpool has 8. So Man City is in second place as they're ahead on goal difference. Now, if you were to just look at the numbers on this table, 20 is the largest. It's the value of Man City's goal difference. Now, this is the largest number, but it's also the lowest priority. As I mentioned at the start, a win is much more substantial than a goal difference. So as a team in the EPL, it's a lot more important to have 1 win over, say, 100 goal difference. The category of win, draw, and goal difference is really important and have a lower priority as we move from left to right. This same principle applies to specificity. So what is specificity? Specificity determines the priority of a CSS rule when multiple rules apply to the same element. Let's have a look at this snippet of HTML. We have an H1 nested inside a div, which is then nested inside another div. In our CSS, we have 4 different ways of selecting the same element. The first rule is using the ID selector. The second rule is using the descendant selector, where the class textbox is the parent and the class large is the child. The third rule is also using the descendant selector, where we're first selecting the div as the parent using the type selector, then selecting the next div down as the child using the type selector, and then using the class large which is the grandchild to select the heading. And the fourth rule, again uses the descendant selector, but instead of using the class large to select the heading, we're using the type selector h1. So all these CSS rules are selecting the same element, the h1, but they're using a mix of different selectors, and they're all trying to apply a different color. So which color ends up being applied? To do that, we need to do a specificity calculation. A specificity calculation is very similar in nature to the sports table, where instead of wins, draws, and goal differences, we have the type of selector, ID, class and pseudoclass, and type. Where as we move from left to right, these selectors have a lower priority. So an ID selector is like a win, a class and pseudoclass selector is like a draw, and a type selector is like a goal difference. So let's now go through all 4 CSS rules we just saw earlier and tally this up. The first selector was the ID selector heading. There's just one ID selector here, so this gets 1 point. There's no class or pseudoclass selector, and there's no type selector. The next rule we saw was the descendant selector using 2 classes. There are no IDs here, so this gets 0. And there are 2 class selectors here, textbox and large, so this gets 2 points. And there are no type selectors, so we get 0 points. The next CSS rule looked like this. There are no ID selectors, so this gets 0 points. There is 1 class selector being used, large, so this gets 1 point. And there are 2 type selectors, the 2 divs, so this gets 2 points. The last rule looked like this. In this case, there are no IDs being used, so the ID column gets 0. There are no class and pseudoclasses being used, so we give 0 here. And there are 3 type selectors being used, div, div, and h1. So the type column gets 3 points. So the ID selector heading is at the top of the table. Back to the football analogy, it's like it has 1 win, whereas all the other selector combinations don't have any wins. And we say that this selector has the highest specificity. In other words, it's the most specific selector used. And you can see each row is ordered correctly in terms of its specificity. For example, the next row down, where we have the 2 classes textbox and large, this uses 2 classes, which is like 2 draws. So that's a higher specificity of the combination below it, the div, div, and large class, where that only has 1 class and 2 type selectors. And once again, if you look at this table, the largest number on it is 3, which are 3 type selectors on the div, div, and h1. But the biggest number doesn't matter, because the type is like goal difference. It isn't such an important number compared to an ID, which is like a win. So let's finish up by talking about some specificity guidance. Long story short, don't worry too much about it. The concept of specificity and the calculations behind it can seem a bit confusing. I can assure you, you're not going to be sitting there with a calculator trying to work out its specificity value whenever you're applying a CSS rule. Specificity is just something you need to know about so that you understand when you're applying conflicting selectors, which one is winning and why. The reason I don't want you to worry too much about it is because it is common to use the type selector for global styles and the class selector to override this for specific styling. For example, on this page, the heading 2 over here would be a global style with a specific font weight, color, font size, etc. So by default, within our application, all H2s will be styled this way. Within the application, there may be specific circumstances we want to override that default global styling. For example, this H2 over here, we could create a class called white, where we would override the H2 color property with a white color using the class. And the reason this works is because a class selector is more specific than a type selector. So long story short, don't stress about specificity. We're generally going to be styling global styles using type selectors and using class selectors to override this style for specific cases. It is also important to understand the concept of specificity so that when you write your own CSS and rules aren't being applied as you'd expect, you can start thinking about the specificity of conflicting selectors. So let's complete the summary card, pseudoclasses and specificity. We looked at specificity. We saw that specificity determines priority of a CSS rule when multiple conflicting rules are applied to the same element. We looked at an example of HTML like this, where we were targeting the H1 in 4 different ways. We saw that we could calculate the specificity of each selector where ID, class and pseudoclass, and type selectors had a lower priority from left to right. In the example, we looked at 4 different cases, where filling in the table, the heading was 100, the 2 class selectors was 020, the 2 type selectors and class was 012, and the 3 type selectors was 003. And therefore the heading, which is an ID class, had the highest specificity, as any ID selectors were much more specific than a class or pseudoclass or type selector, just like a goal was more important than a draw. The guidance we saw was that we use the type selector for global styles and class selector to override for specific styling. It's now time to learn a fundamental concept in CSS, where certain styles can be passed down from parent element to child elements through inheritance.
We'll be discussing what is inheritance and specificity, what gets inherited, and inheritance and text-align.
So this chapter is getting my more difficult stamp,
The concepts we're going to be exploring are just a little bit more challenging.
especially towards the end of the chapter when we talk about inheritance and text-align.
So what is CSS inheritance? It's when properties set on parent elements are passed down to their children by default. Let's take a look at an example to see what I mean. We have this snippet of HTML where we have a div container element with the class hero section, and it contains a heading 1 and paragraph element. Looking now at the CSS, we've added the CSS rule color blue to the hero section. Now this rule is set on a parent. So what happens here is the parent element passes down this styling to its children. So the H1 and paragraph get this blue color. And we say the blue color is inherited. So that's the basic idea of inheritance. Properties set on parent elements will be passed down to their children. And now quickly want to touch on inheritance and specificity. Specific selectors will override inherited styles, as inherited styles have a very low specificity. I'm going to update our CSS to now include this rule, where we're styling our paragraph red. We're using the type selector here, which has a higher specificity compared to inherited styles, meaning our rule above, where we're adding the color blue to the container and it's being passed down to the heading, is a very low specificity. So almost any time we're using a specific selector, like a type, class, or ID selector, to target a specific element, it will always override inherited styles. So in our paragraph, the red color is applied, as it's overriding the blue color applied on the div, which is being inherited by the paragraph. Let's see this in action inside DevTools on the monday.com homepage. I'm going to right-click, Inspect to open up the DevTools, and I'm just going to select this text over here. We can see the styles that have been applied directly to this element here. It's got a font weight of 600, font size 60 pixels, and a line height of 100%. If we scroll down, we can see over here inherited from. This color is being inherited from somewhere else. If I scroll down more, you can see that the text-align center is also being inherited. Now I want to show you an example of what I was talking about earlier. How applying styles directly on the element will always override conflicting inherited styles. You can see here, for example, the font size is being set to 60 pixels directly on the element. If I scroll down here and have a look at inherited from body, which is the body tag, the font size 16 pixels has been crossed out. It's because, as I mentioned earlier, applying styles with inheritance has a very low specificity. So when we have conflicting styles, one which is being inherited versus one which is being applied directly, the one which is being applied directly will always win out. And that's why we end up with a font size of 60 pixels. So the next question I want to answer is what gets inherited? It is mainly text properties that are inherited from parent to child.
So properties like these.
I'm not going to read them out, but feel free to pause to have a look at them. This is really important to remember. It's mainly text properties that are inherited. So try your best to remember that fact, because it can sometimes be confusing when you're applying a property to a parent and you're wondering why it isn't being inherited. More often than not, you're applying a non-text property. So by way of example, let's say we have the same HTML snippet we saw before, and we now apply these two styles to the div, a color blue and a border that's 5 pixels solid and black. Now I know we haven't looked at the border property yet, We'll be discussing it at great length in the next topic, but unfortunately at this stage, we haven't really covered many non-text properties, so I have to put something there, and hopefully border is somewhat intuitive. Because border is a non-text property, it's not going to be inherited by the children, so only the color blue will be passed down to the heading and paragraph. So let's go play around with inheritance inside VS Code. I've created a new mini project where I have an index.html file with the boilerplate ready. I've added in a link element, which links to an empty style sheet app.css. All right, inside the body, let's go add a container element with some div tags. I'm then going to add in an h1, a paragraph, and an anchor tag. I'm just going to give this div a class of hero-section. Heading over to app.css, let's select this class, and we'll give it a few text properties. Font size of 30 pixels, the color blue, and let's make it all uppercase with text transform uppercase. Let's check this out in the browser. So let's look at what we see here. I'm going to start with the paragraph. This element has inherited everything from the container. The color is blue and it's all uppercase. Now for the anchor tag, the font size is 30 pixels and it's all uppercase, but it isn't blue. And the reason is because the browser has built-in styles that are applied directly to the element.
We saw this in the pseudo-classes chapter where we can style the pseudo-class visited.
Because I have visited google.com, the default styling of the visited pseudo-class in the browser is purple. So that default style will override the inherited style, which we know has a very low specificity. And the same thing's happening on the heading here. The heading is inheriting the blue color and text transform uppercase, but the font size is bigger than 30 pixels. And we can actually see this default browser styling inside DevTools. If I go to inspect and click on the heading, you can see over here, the H1 have these default styles that are set directly on it inside the browser. One of them is font size 2M. And you can see my styling, which I'm setting on the parent and is being inherited, is being crossed out. And because there's no default styling for color or text transform, they are being applied. But we have conflicting rules for font size set directly on the H1 for the default styling in the browser, and for the font size I'm setting on the parent, which is being inherited. And as we know, inheritance has a very low specificity, so the default font size of 2Ms will win. Now, in practice, don't let this freak you out too much, because it's very rare we're actually going to be using the default styles inside the browser. Like we've seen in our Quill project already, we are explicitly styling the H1 in our CSS. So in almost all cases, we're always going to override the default browser styling with our own styles. And this brings me to the important topic of inheritance guidance. Make sure you marry a rich partner. That's good advice for the real world. But in CSS, global font styles are set on the body element so that all child text elements inherit styles by default. Let's have a look at an example of what I mean with this snippet of HTML. I've got a section container, which has inside a heading and paragraph, and then I've got a footer with a single paragraph. Inside the CSS, we would select the body element, which we know is the main wrapper element inside the HTML file for all content displayed on the page. We would set default text properties here, like the color, font weight, and font family. All these text properties are then inherited. Now, a property like font size would not be set here, because usually every text element, like a heading 1, heading 2, paragraph, etc., has its own distinct font size. Whereas setting something like a color is a good idea. It gives us a base color for all our text elements, and then anytime we need a specific color, we can just override it with specific styling rules.
We will be using this method in our Quill project.
Once we've done that, we next want to set global font styles on type selectors, which will override inherited properties. I'm going to make some more space in our CSS file here, and I'm going to add this H1. The properties defined in the body are still being inherited, and any newly defined conflicting styles, like color and font weight, will override the inherited styles. So the H1 will now have a color of blue, a font weight of 700. The font family will still be Arial, which is inherited from the body, as there's no conflicting style there. And the font size, which is a newly defined property, will be 52 pixels. Setting default text properties on the body element is very, very common, but inheritance is also often utilized for a container that requires specific text styling. In the HTML snippet we have on the left here, I'm going to simply add a class to the section with the value hero section. I'm then going to update our CSS where I'm targeting the hero section and adding a text transform property. So this style is applied on the container. So we end up with our heading 1, which will result in uppercase on both heading and paragraph elements. So it's very common to use inheritance both to set default text styles on the body, as well as use inheritance within particular sections of the page. So the last thing I want to focus on is inheritance and the text align property, as this can cause a lot of confusion. We've already seen text align affects block level elements, but has no impact on inline level elements. We spent a fair bit of time with this in the previous topic when we were looking at text elements. But just as a quick recap, let's say I have a page with a heading 1 and a paragraph. Headings and paragraphs are block elements, which means they take up the full width of the page. If we were to apply text align center onto the heading and paragraph, the content inside the box gets centered. So our text will display like this. And this is because there's space to move within the box of the heading and paragraph. Let's compare this behavior to the anchor tag. An anchor tag is an inline element, which means it only takes up the width of the content and doesn't extend the full width of the page. So if we were to apply text align to the anchor tag, there is no space to center the text. So the anchor tag doesn't move. Jumping back into VS Code with the file we were playing around with earlier, I've got a heading 1, a paragraph, and an anchor tag. I'm going to head over to app.css and just remove these styles. The heading 1, I'll grab text align and set the value to center. For the paragraph, I'll do the same thing. And for the anchor tag, I'm also going to set text align to center. So let's check this out in the browser. So as expected, our block level elements, the heading and paragraph, get centered, whereas there's no impact on the anchor tag. And we can see why visually when I go to DevTools. When I click on the heading, you can see the blue box, which is the space the heading can move. The same for the paragraph tag. Whereas when I hover over the anchor tag, the blue box is just the content itself. There's no space for it to move. So now I want to show you something which will blow your mind. I'm going to remove these styles. And now I'm going to add text align onto the parent container, this div here. I'll add the class hero section, and I'll put text align as center. I'm going to refresh the page and watch what happens. Both the block and inline elements are being centered. So what is happening here? So we've just seen that when applying the text align property to a block level parent containing inline elements, all children will be impacted. So in the example we just looked at, we had a block level parent, which is a div. And as a quick reminder, a div is a blockline element. And we applied text align center to this, which ended up centering the block elements and the inline elements. So there's actually two things going on here. The first is that child elements are centered, where the child elements here are the heading 1, paragraph, and anchor tag. To really highlight this point, I kind of want to move away from these elements. I'm going to fill in the block elements like this, and I'm going to fill in the inline element like this. Now for the block elements, there is no impact on block elements as the element is already full width. I want us to view these elements as children rather than specific H1, paragraph, etc. elements. Just view it as a red box. Because the red box is a block element, it takes up the full width. So this child cannot move anywhere inside the div. In contrast, the inline element is centered as it has space to move. Again, just view it as a green box inside this div element. And because text align center is set on the div, which means all child elements of the div are centered, the inline element will be centered. And it has space to move because the inline element only takes up the width of the content itself. So that's the first thing going on. Child elements are centered, and the major impact here is on inline elements, which end up being centered. And there's actually no impact on block elements. Now, something else I want to quickly mention before we move on is that this in fact can be any inline element. For example, if we had an image that was this size, it would also be centered. So that's why I took this approach of coloring it in green. I just want you to see it as a green box. It doesn't really matter what inline element it is. From the div's perspective, it just sees it as a general child. So let's now have a look at the second thing going on. The second thing happening is that child elements inherit the text-align property. And again, inheritance is when we're passing on the property from parent to child. It's like the H1 and paragraph now have text-align applied directly to them through inheritance. And this is just now the standard behavior we've seen before, where text is centered inside block elements as there's space to move. So the second thing that would happen is our text inside our block elements, H1 and paragraph, will center. And there's no impact on inline elements as text has no space to move. Again, this is just a regular behavior we've always seen. When you try to apply text-align center onto an anchor tag, it won't move. And in this case, the text-align center property has been inherited from the parent div. So the net effect from these two different things going on is that both the block elements and the inline element are centered. Now, at the end of the day, you just need to remember that when you apply the text-align property onto a block-level container like a div, everything inside it will get centered. I spent a bit of time explaining what's going on behind the scenes because I think it is useful you have a basic understanding. So let's finish off by building our next summary card, inheritance and the universal selector. We looked at inheritance, which is where properties set on parent elements are passed to child elements by default. And we saw this was mainly for text properties. We saw an example with a snippet of HTML like this, and we applied CSS styling rules onto the body. And we saw that all the text properties were inherited by all the HTML elements wrapped by the body tag. For inheritance guidance, we said global font styles are set on the body element. We also looked at inheritance and text-align. We saw that when applying text-align to a block-level parent, both block and inline elements are impacted. We looked at an example where we had a div, and we applied the text-align property to this div container. We had an H1 and paragraph, which are both block elements, and block elements inherit the text-align property. This causes them to center inside their box. We saw an anchor tag, which is an inline element, and inline elements have space to move inside the block container, which results in the anchor tag being centered. So applying text-align to a container results in both block and inline elements being centered, just through different mechanisms.
So let's now go and use inheritance inside our Quill project.
I'm going to go grab the body, add our curly brackets, and let's start adding in our global font styles. The first one I'm going to put in here is the font family. I'm just going to copy it from here and paste it in the body. Now, because I'm defining it on the body, which means that all child text elements will inherit this, I'm now actually going to remove it from any other location we're defining this to avoid duplicate declarations. So I'm going to remove it from here, and we also have it on our paragraph anchor and small text. And I also have it down here on our BTN class. So I'm going to go remove it over here as well.
Now, previously in this topic,
I did speak about explicitly defining some properties on the BTN class, so it's clear the properties being used in our buttons. However, now that we've learnt about inheritance, the best practice is we define our global base font styles on the body. So something like font family is just applied to every single property. So there's no need to explicitly define font family on the button as well. So in doing this, we've now consolidated our font family property onto the body, which is being applied to all text properties through inheritance. The other properties I'm going to be adding, I'm going to go grab down here. I'm going to copy these and paste them inside our body. Now, the reason I'm selecting a font weight of 400, a line height of 1.5, and our base gray color is because those are the default text properties I want. As we've seen, they're used on elements like paragraphs, anchor tags, smaller text, etc. I kind of see these elements as a bit more commonly used throughout the application, whereas headings are a bit more specialist. So that's why I want to use these properties as my default properties. So I'm going to scroll back down here and simply remove this now. Now I could also remove the font weight of 400 in our button class, because that's now set on our body tag. And through inheritance, our anchor tag will get applied the style. However, with a component like a button, it actually is still good practice to keep the font weight explicitly defined here. That's because something like a font weight on a button could be different. You could have a 500, 600, or 700 value here. So it is always a good idea to explicitly define the font weight, even if it is the same as the font weight in your body tag. As I mentioned before, something like font family, you don't need to explicitly define in your button, because in this application, all the text elements have the same font family. So by default, all our text properties will now inherit these styles.
If you remember from earlier on in this topic,
Once we define our base text properties on the body, we next go and set global font styles on type selectors. We've actually already done this. We have our default styling inside the body, and then we have specific styling on type selectors. For the font weight, we're setting it as 700, which will override this 400. The line height as 1.2, which will override this line height. This darker shade of gray, which will override this color. And we're also adding a new property on, the letter spacing of -2 pixels. And again, the reason these are overriding is because properties through inheritance have a very low specificity, and the type selector has a higher specificity. So these properties will override inherited properties. And then of course we're selecting each heading and applying its unique properties, like font size.
now if you remember just earlier,
We saw the power of applying text align on container elements, where it centers both inline and block elements. So let's now go and use this to our advantage inside the Quill project. For the hero section, it would be nice to center all of this content instead of just the H1. The feature section we're going to leave as it is, because that final layout has this content on the left with images on the right. The call to action section containing this heading and this anchor tag would also be nice to center, and the entire footer would also be great to center. So let's now code this up inside VS Code. I'm back inside the index.html file for our Quill project. I'm going to scroll down to the hero section and add in a class and give it the value hero section. I'm going to scroll down to the CTA section and give this a class of CTA section. And for the footer, I'm going to give this a class of footer. Now, of course, I could use the type selector in CSS and not add a class, but this is generally considered better practice. So heading over to app.css, I'm going to add the hero section class, grab the curly brackets, and add the property text align center. I'll do the same thing with the CTA section, and the same thing with the footer. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see now that our hero section is all nice and centered. Same thing with our call to action section, and same thing with our footer. Now, just a few comments at this point. The first is, this does work, using text align center on a parent element to center all the children. And once again, like we've discussed, even the inline elements are centered, like the anchor tag over here or images over here. Later on, we'll be talking about Flexbox, which is the more modern way of handling alignment. So while this does work, later on in the CSS module, we will be exploring new modern and advanced methods. The next thing I want to comment is that these links over here and these images are actually a little bit off center. If you compare it to this text over here, you can see that the center line kind of comes down here to the right. If I go to DevTools and hover over this paragraph text here, you can see the blue box extends the full width of the page. Whereas over here, the list item has a little bit of space on the left here, which when I hover over it goes green. This has to do with the CSS box model, and we'll be correcting this in the next topic. But I just wanted to point that out now, in case you were wondering why this looks a bit funny down here. Before we finish up, I just want to tidy up our CSS file a bit. The first thing I want to do is remove text align where we no longer need it. I'm going to scroll up, and I'm going to remove text align on our H1, as we're now handling that with inheritance on the parent element. We had also previously defined text align center on our H2. In our HTML, the H2 is used as a heading for each section. For example, the feature section has an H2, and the call to action section has an H2. The H2 over here is now being centered through inheritance that we defined over here. So if I remove text align center from this H2, the H2 in the call to action section will still be centered, but the H2 in the features section will no longer be centered. It generally isn't a good idea to have a text-aligned center set as a global style like this on an H2, because not all H2s will be aligned center, whereas all H2s will be 48 pixels. So to correct this, I'm going to delete the text-align property here, and I'm going to add a new class to this H2. We'll call it features main heading. Scrolling down in the CSS file, we'll add the class features main heading, and we'll give it the text-align property of center. So this is much better. I'm now just centering this heading for this particular instance, instead of globally using the H2 type selector. Let's check this out in the browser. So as expected, there's no actual net change. The heading 2 is still centered here, which is being controlled by this. And the heading 2 over here is also being centered, which is being controlled by inheritance over here. Okay, the last thing I want to do is just tidy the CSS document itself up a bit. You may be noticing things are now getting a little bit out of hand. We need some better structure to organize this. So what I'm going to do is split up the CSS document into 3 main sections. I'm going to add a comment by hitting Command/ on my Mac, add a whole bunch of dashes, and give this the title Global Styles. I'll copy these dashes on the other end as well. I'm just going to copy this entire comment as well, as I'll be using this syntax as a title below. So all these styles below are global styles. They're setting things like the font size of all H1s, or all the text properties on the body that are being inherited. The next series of styles I'm going to call components. These are pieces of reusable UI we're going to be using throughout the application. The button is a great example of a component. The next section is going to be called sections. These are different sections of our web page. And I'm going to put it in order as it appears on the page. I'm going to add a comment, and this time I'm only going to add a few dashes to make it appear as a subheading of sections. The first section with specific styling for is the hero section. I'll copy this for the next section, which is the features section. That's this piece of code over here. I'm going to cut that and pop it above over here. The next section we have is the CTA section, and the next section is the footer. So using comments to create headings like this helps better structure our CSS file, where we first have all our global styles, our different components, which we're going to be adding to as we move through the course, and different sections of the page, where we'll also be adding a whole bunch of new CSS rules.
Next, we'll see how to target all elements on a page with one simple rule using the universal selector.
We'll be discussing what is the universal selector and the universal selector versus body tag inheritance. So what is the universal selector? The universal selector applies styles to all elements. Let's take a look at this snippet of HTML. It contains a section and footer. In our CSS, I'm going to apply this style rule. The selector you see here is the universal selector. It's an asterisk symbol. The styles inside the declaration block applies to every single element. And when I say every element, I mean every element. Even structural elements like bodies, sections, and footers, as well as, of course, regular content elements like headings and paragraphs. So let's now play around with the universal selector inside VS Code. I've set up this simple HTML file where I've got a div container with the class of hero section, and inside it, I've got a heading 1, a paragraph, and a hyperlink. I've also linked a style sheet called app.css, which is currently empty. So let's go and add our universal selector, which is the asterisk symbol, grab our curly brackets, and let's add a few properties which will be applied to every single element. Let's make any text property with the color blue, and then I'm also going to add a border top, which is a CSS box model property we haven't spoken about yet, but I do want to use a non-text property so that this will apply to every element. We'll give the border top a width of 5 pixels, it will be solid, and let's make it red. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see that every text element we have is now blue, and every HTML element has a red border top. The border thickness is 5 pixels, but you can see in some locations it's a bit thicker.
So let's have a look in DevTools why this is happening. I'm going to grab the inspector tool. I'm going to click on this first element here. This is the root HTML element, which is getting a red border top. It's this element here in our HTML. The next element is the body element, which is also getting a red border top. If I move my mouse down slightly, you can see that this box is the div container, which is also getting a red border top. Because these are just container elements, the body and the div, without any content between it, it's like the border tops are being stacked on top of one another, which makes them appear thicker. So in a nutshell, any properties that are applied on the universal selector are applied on every single element in your HTML. Now I do quickly want to contrast this to inheritance, which we looked at earlier. I'm going to just comment this out by highlighting it and hitting Command/ on my Mac or Control/ on a Windows. I now want to apply these same styles but using inheritance. I'll grab the body tag and I'll copy these styles in the curly brackets. I'm going to hit refresh, and what we can see is that only the blue color is being applied to our text, and the border top is only being applied once. It's only being applied to the body element, where this style is declared. And if you remember, it's because only text properties are inherited. So the color blue is inherited by all text children, whereas border top is a non-text property, so it's only being applied on the body. Towards the end of this chapter, I will be doing a more comprehensive comparison between what styles to put on a universal selector versus the body, as I know it can be a bit confusing, the subtlety between them. So let's now have a look at how we use the universal selector. So we'll now be going through the universal selector guidance. The universal selector is primarily used for resetting default properties and is not typically used for applying specific styling. It's like doing a factory reset on your computer or phone, completely clearing it out, making it how it was like when you first bought it. So what default properties are we actually resetting? I'm back inside our Quill project where we got up to in the last chapter. I'm going to open up DevTools. I'm going to grab the inspector and click on a few elements. We'll start with this heading. You can see on this heading, it's got some default margin, which is space between the element and other elements. You can see it in the orange. Same thing with the paragraph. It's got some built-in spacing called margin between the paragraph and the elements surrounding it. If I go up to our navigation bar, these list items, which are inside an unordered list, they've also got some default styling. If I hover over the left here to select the unordered list, you can see this green box, which is called padding. It's default styling rules applied to unordered lists, so that our lists get slightly indented. So we typically use the universal selector to remove this default styling of margin and padding. So the properties we put inside the universal selector have to do with CSS box model properties, which we will be looking at great length in the next topic. So we don't really have much use for it right now, but we will be using it to remove the default spacing on elements, specifically margin and padding. Don't even worry about what those terms mean right now. Just realize it's not used for setting any text properties. Back in our Quill project, at the top of the global styles, I just want to go make a comment, which will be add in universal selector later to remove default spacing properties. So we can't use the universal selector just yet, because we still need to understand more about the CSS box model. But once we do understand that, we will replace this comment with the universal selector and some box model properties that will remove the default spacing. And while we're here, I just want to remind you again that we use inheritance on the body type selector to set all font properties. So just to drive the message home of the difference between the universal selector and body tag inheritance, I've created this table to compare them side by side, as I personally found it quite confusing to know what is used where. So let's start with the body tag and inheritance. The CSS properties we add inside the body only applies text properties to its children. So it's primarily used to set default text properties across our application. On the other hand, the universal selector applies all properties to all elements throughout the application, not just text properties. The universal selector is primarily used to reset default styles, which again, we need to learn about box model properties to implement this. In a one-sentence nutshell,
The body tag and inheritance is used to apply styles, whereas the universal selector is used to remove styles. So that's probably the easiest way to think about it. Body tag and inheritance, adding text styles. Universal selector, removing default styles. So let's finish up by continuing to add to our summary card inheritance and the universal selector. We looked at the universal selector, which applies styles to all elements. The universal selector is an asterisk symbol, and in this example, the color blue and border top is applied to every single HTML element. We saw that the guidance was the universal selector is most commonly used for resetting default styles.
Finally, in the last chapter of this topic, we'll explore how to style specific parts of an element using pseudo-elements.
We'll be discussing what are pseudo-elements, the pseudo-elements for text styling, selection, and content insertion. So what are pseudo-elements? Pseudo-elements are used to style a specific part of an element. They're not to be confused with pseudo-classes, which we saw was used to style a specific state of an element, like hovering over an anchor tag. Let's look at the syntax for a pseudo-element. We have a selector, like an H2, and then we add on our pseudo-element, which is made up of a double colon and the pseudo-element name. Now, just a small note at this point, pseudo-elements are not overly common. I'm not going to be using them throughout the course, but I do just want you to know that they do exist in case you see them out there in the wild. When I first learned CSS, I felt very overwhelmed with all the selectors I'd learnt, and especially scary worded ones like pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements. Pseudo-classes are very, very important. You always use them on anchor tags. Pseudo-elements are not that common, so don't stress too much about them.
So let's now take a look at different pseudo-elements. The first group of pseudo-elements have to do with text styling,
where they're used to enhance visual appearance of text. The first example of this is the first letter pseudo-element, which, as the name suggests, will target the first letter inside a text element like a heading or paragraph, and this gives us something called a drop cap, which you can see in my image here, where the first letter will be larger than the rest. This kind of styling you'll often see in some publications like books or magazines. The other text styling pseudo-element is first line, which, as the name suggests, targets the first line of text, and often this will be a paragraph opening line, as a paragraph usually contains multiple lines of text. So let's play around with these in VS Code. I've prepared this index.html file ahead of time. It's got my boilerplate code and just an h1 and paragraph element. I've also linked an app.css style sheet, which is currently empty. So let's use the first letter pseudo-element to target this paragraph. I'll use the p-type selector, add 2 colons, and then add the pseudo-element name, first letter. I'll grab our curly brackets, and let's add some styles. A common one would be text transform to uppercase. This will give us that capital letter as the first letter. Let's make the font size 30 pixels, and let's give it a font weight of 700. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see in our paragraph, the L over here, which is the first letter of the paragraph, is uppercase. It's got a larger font size of 30 pixels, and it's got a font weight of 700. And as I said before, this is called a drop cap. I'm going to comment out this style. Let's go add the other pseudo-element we saw. I'll again grab the paragraph, add 2 colons, and this time we're going to be using the first line pseudo-element. I'll grab our curly brackets, and let's just use the same styles here. I'll copy them and paste them here. Let me refresh the browser, and you can see now the first line is all uppercase, has a font size of 30 pixels, and has a font weight of 700. So text styling with pseudo-elements targets specific parts of the element. We saw first letter, and now first line. The next type of pseudo-element is selection. This is used to visually enhance the text a user selects. And as you guessed, the pseudo-element name is selection. Let's play around with this one in VS Code. I'm going to get rid of these styles. I'm going to grab the paragraph again, add my double colons, and add the pseudo-element name selection. Add curly brackets, and let's give this a color of red. Let's see what this does in the browser. So initially, it doesn't look like any change. To see the selection pseudo-element in action, we need to go and highlight the text. So I'm going to grab my cursor and select the text as if I'm going to copy it. And you can see it's turning red. So that's selection in action. The last pseudo-element type is content insertion. This is used for adding decorative elements without altering the HTML structure. There are two content insertion pseudo-elements. The first is before, and the second is after. As you could guess, using before adds the decorative elements before the HTML element you're targeting, and after adds the insertion after the element you're targeting. Let's have a look at this inside VS Code. Looking back on the HTML file, what I'd like to do is on my H1, I'd like to have a little beta symbol to signify that this application is in beta. Now, I don't really want that beta to be part of my HTML markup. It's kind of more like a little decorative element. It doesn't really make sense to have that inside my HTML structure. So I can use the before and after property to inject that element when the page renders. Heading over to app.css, I'm going to get rid of this style. I'm going to grab the H1, add 2 colons, and I'm going to use the after pseudo element. This will add the decorative element that I'm adding here after the H1. Now, a common property to use inside the before and after pseudo element is content. And we use quotation marks to write the content we want to appear. In this case, the word beta. And then we just use regular CSS text properties, like font size, which I'll make 12 pixels, and color, which I'll make purple. So let's see what this looks like in the browser. So you can see the word beta has been inserted into the page after my H1 heading. Now, usually you'd want to style this a bit more. You'd probably want to move it, say a little bit up and left, and also maybe give it a background color. Now, we can't do those things just yet because we need to learn more about positioning and the CSS box model, but you could imagine how this would look on a final page. And again, just to reiterate the subtlety of this beta is not actually an HTML element. It's being injected into the page when it renders. We can see this in DevTools as well. If I go into the heading, you can see welcome to the app, which is our heading text, and the pseudo element after, which has the properties we defined in our CSS.
So let's complete the summary card, inheritance, and the universal selector.
We looked at pseudo elements, which styles a specific part of an element. We had a selector, like an H2, which was then followed by 2 colons and the pseudo element name, like first letter. This gave us a pseudo element.
Another topic done and dusted. We've now finished CSS selectors. Let's now move on to one of the most important concepts in CSS, the CSS box model. The CSS box model is the foundation of layout design, determining how elements are sized and spaced on a web page. In this section, we'll break down its key components, content dimensions, padding, borders, and margins, and cover layout rules that control element sizing and behavior. Let's start off nice and slow with the CSS box model introduction. We'll be discussing HTML element boxes and the CSS box model. Looking back at much earlier on in the CSS course, I introduced you to these 3 overarching concepts in CSS: content, box, and layout. We've already looked at content, the stuff about what's inside the box, and we looked at a whole variety of text properties like font size and font weight. Now it's time to have a look at the box itself. So we'll be taking a deep dive into the CSS box model. The CSS box model describes how all HTML elements are treated as rectangular boxes. So for example, every single HTML element on this page has an invisible box around it, whether it's a text element like a heading or paragraph, or an image. We've already seen this in DevTools. When we inspect an element, we get a blue box appearing around it, like this heading and paragraph over here. Now in the CSS box model, each box has its own set of properties. Let's look at this page as an example. We have an H2, paragraph, and some anchor tags. I've put the block elements in red, and the inline element, the anchor tag, in green. So if we were to look at these in DevTools, we'd see boxes that look like this, where the H2 and paragraph extend the full width of the page, or in this case, the full width of the container it's in, and the anchor tags just take up the width the content occupies, so just the anchor tag text. So let's now have a look at some of these box properties. The first obvious one we can see is this border. We then have some space between the content and the border, and we also have space between boxes. So you can see the CSS box model has a lot to do with spacing, both within elements and between elements. The CSS box model also applies to container elements, like divs and semantic elements. So for example, all of this content is inside a div. So in DevTools, we'd see a box that looks like this. Now looking at this box property, we can see that there's space between the content and border. And over here, we can see that there's space between boxes, between this box and the content above. Now in this case, there isn't actually a border. There's just been some background color applied to the space between the content and where the border would be to give an impression like there is a border there. So let's now look at the CSS box model properties in detail. We're going to be doing that by zooming in to the See Live Demo button. So the first thing we have is the content. This is just the text See Live Demo. The content has a width and a height. Now the content is any HTML element, like text, images, links, forms, etc. The next box model property we have is padding. Padding is the space between content and border and is still considered part of the element. So in our button, padding is the space between the See Live Demo text and the blue border that surrounds it. It's space between the content and the border. The next CSS box model property is border. Border is a line around the element and is still part of the element. So the content itself, the padding, and the border are all part of the element. The final property is called margin. Margin is the space outside of the element, separating it from other elements. It's kind of like a force field around the element. Now, because margin is the space outside the element, it is not technically considered part of the element. There are some properties we're going to look at later that when applied to an HTML element will impact the content, padding, and border, but won't impact the margin. Now, the best way to think of the CSS box model is by looking at paintings and posters. I've just grabbed a couple of these off Etsy. I've got this frame picture here by an awesome street artist called Banksy. The picture itself is the content. The rose gold frame is the border. Often in these kinds of framed artwork, you'll have this kind of like setting space between the picture and the frame, and this would be equivalent to padding. It's the space between the content and the border. Looking now at a regular wall poster, all we have here is content. There's no border, like a photo frame, and there's no padding. The last example is a framed poster, where we have the content, and in this case, there's no padding. The content is directly touching the frame. In the CSS box model, that would be the border. Now imagine these on your wall. It's unlikely you'd put them all next to each other. You'd want to space them out a bit. This space in the CSS box model is margin. We have some margin between the first and second artwork, specifically between the border of one and the content edge of another. And between the second and third, we have some margin between the content edge of the LeBron James poster and the border edge of the other framed poster. Throughout the CSS topic, I'm going to keep referring back to this diagram because sometimes the subtleties of things like padding and margin can seem a bit confusing. So this is a fantastic real-world example to help you properly understand the CSS box model when talking about content, padding, border, and margin. So let's wrap up by starting to build the summary card, the CSS box model. In this chapter, we looked at the different components of the box model. We started with our content in purple, which has both a width and a height. The content can then be surrounded by some padding. This can then be enclosed by a border. And we saw that the content, padding, and border are all part of the element. We can then add some margin to create space between our element and other elements. Next up, we'll learn how to add visual style to our elements by setting the background color. We'll be discussing the background color property, background color guidance, and color versus background color.
So what does the background color property do? It sets the background color of an element and applies it to the content and padding. So let's have a look at this visually. Let's say we had some content, like a text element, and this content had some padding on it. Let's also apply a border. Now, if we were to apply background color on this HTML element, the background color would be applied to both the content and the padding, but not the border. So that's something really important to keep in mind. That background color both gets applied to the background of the content itself, as well as any padding present. So let's have a look at the background color property. Background-color is the property, and the value can be any color value. So typical values you'd see would be RGB, hex, RGBA, or HSL.
And we've already spoken in depth about color earlier on in the course.
Now in CSS, hex colors are the most commonly used. and we'll be using that color system throughout this course. So just to show you the background color property in action, I'm on this web page here. I'm going to jump into DevTools, and I'm going to click on this button here. You can see this blue background color here. The background color is being applied to the content, which in this case is anchor text book a call, and it's also being applied to the padding, the space between the content and its border. If I were to turn background color off, you can see the background color is removed from both the content and the padding. And if I were to turn the padding off over here, you can see the background color has only been applied to the content, the anchor text book a call. Now, when making this video, I've been faced with a bit of a chicken and egg because we haven't looked at padding yet. And to explain background color, we need to know about padding, but also to better understand padding, it's helpful to know background color. So don't worry so much about the padding property itself right now, as long as you understand that padding is the space between the content and its border, and that background color gets applied to the padding and the content. So let's now take a look at some background color guidance. It's sometimes used to set the background color of an entire page. So for example here, this entire page has had a gray background color applied to it. A lot of times web pages will just be a default white, but you will see pages like this, with an actual background color applied. The background color property is commonly used to set the background color of page sections. So this page on the left here, the hero section is in this dark green. If we were to scroll down the page, you can see the nav bar is in this same dark green, whereas the testimonial section is in this very light purple. Background color is also commonly used in components. And if you remember, a component is a piece of reusable UI. That is, a piece of user interface that will appear in multiple places throughout the web application. For example, on this page, we have this component called a card, which has this grayy background color. And on the same application, we have buttons like this, where a turquoisey background color has been applied to this button. Now I want to quickly compare color and background color, because sometimes it can be a bit confusing. So starting off with color. Color applies to text elements, and the CSS property looks like this. Background color applies to the background of an element, and the syntax looks like this. So just keep in mind, color is for text, and background color is for the background of an element, and it's applied to the element and any padding if it's present.
So let's now add to our summary card the CSS box model. In this chapter, we started looking at some properties related to content. We looked at the background color, where the property is background-color, or we can add a color value like in hex notation shown here. We also said the background color applies to both content and padding.
So let's now go add background color to the Quill homepage. At the top of the page, we have this highlight, which uses our secondary background color. And some of our buttons are using our primary color as a background color. Further down the page, we have another highlight, where our tertiary color is being used as a background color. And at the bottom of the page, we have this big kind of card, where the background color is our primary color, and also a button, where the background color is our secondary color. So let's jump into VS Code and add background color. So I'm back inside the app.css file for the Quill project. The first thing I want to tackle is the background color for buttons. So I'm going to scroll down to the component section where our buttons live. Just as a quick reminder, the way we've set this up is we first created a btn class, which establishes the structure of the button, which is common to every single button, like the font size being 16 pixels and the text decoration being none. And as we move through the topic, the CSS box model, we will be adding some more properties here. We've then set up our different button styles, the primary button and the secondary button. And we have these pseudo classes, link visited, which are grouped together, and hover active, which are grouped together. Now, this is not actually our design, where the text color is our primary color.
I just did this earlier on as we hadn't yet learnt about background color.
In fact, the way these buttons are set up is that the background color is the primary color for the primary button, and the background color for the secondary button is the secondary color. So I'm simply going to change this to background color, which is now correct, and the text color is just going to be white. Now, instead of doing it like this, what's more common is to actually explicitly define white in our style guide. So I'm going to scroll to the top. Underneath our gray heading, I'm just going to go add the colors black and white. So white, which has the hex code FFF, FFF, 6Fs, And I'm just going to call this white and black, which has the hex code 000000. Now, this might seem a bit silly because they are obvious named colors, but it is good practice to explicitly define every single color inside your color palette. So let's scroll back down. I'm going to remove white and reference it by its hex code, which is 6Fs. Now, for the hover and active state, I'm going to just get rid of this color, and the text color will be white also. But now when we hover, I want it to go a slightly darker blue. So we'll write background color, and we're now going to go get the shade of blue we have. The primary shade we call Deep Sea. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to pop it there. So now what will happen is that the background color of the button will turn a bit darker when we hover over it. Let's now go and do the same thing for our secondary button. The color is now actually the background color, and the text color is just white. For the hover and active state, I'm going to get rid of this, and the text color is white. And for the background color, let's go grab the shade of our secondary color. We called it Velvet Night, and it's this hex code over here. So I'll copy that and paste it as the value. And again, once we hover over this button, it's going to turn a darker shade of purple. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see now this register button over here and the get started button over here, where the BTN primary class is added, has now got a blue background color and white text color. And when I hover over the button, you'll see the background color turns that shade of blue. And if I scroll down to our call to action section, the get started button over here has the secondary background color applied to it. And the same thing will happen when I hover over it. It turns that shade of purple. Now, one thing I do want to highlight at this point is that the background color has just been applied to the element background color.
Coming up soon, we will add padding to improve the readability of these buttons. And as we know, background color is applied to both the content and the padding.
All right, the next thing I want to handle are the different highlights we have in our design. If you can recall, we have a purple highlight running through Mindful Living and an orange highlight running through Simple and Easy. So let's go add those now. Just to quickly explain how we're going to do this, back in the HTML section, we've actually already prepared for this. We added spans, which if you recall are inline container elements, which are often used to group text. So we added a span already for Mindful Living, and we added a span over here for Simple and Easy. So now what we're going to do is go create a new class in our CSS and add the class to this span. So let's jump back to our CSS, and I'm going to create these highlight classes in our components. The reason is because these highlights are considered components as they are reusable pieces of UI. We're currently using them on the homepage, but they could easily feature in other locations of the application. For example, if we had an About Us page, we might want to use the highlights there, just like we're using buttons on all different pages throughout the application. I'm going to be taking the exact same approach as well when creating these highlights. I'm first going to create a highlight class, which just sets up the structure. And then I'm going to create different classes for the different colors. Now, fortunately, highlights will be a bit simpler compared to our buttons, because we don't need to worry about different states. The whole reason we have different states for our buttons was so that when you hover over it, it can change a different color.
So let's go down here and create a new class called Highlight. For now, all I'm going to put in here is the font color, which is just going to be our white. As we move through this topic, we will be adding other properties like padding and border radius, but this is all we can add for now.
I'm now going to go and create the different highlight colors. I'll first create a class called Highlight Primary, grab our curly brackets, and the background color here is the same background color as our primary button. So I'll just copy this declaration here. I'll then add our Highlight Secondary, and again, this is the same background color as the secondary button. So I'll just grab the declaration there. And then finally, I'll create Highlight Tertiary. And the background color here is going to be our tertiary color, which we called Pumpkin. And it's this hex code over here. So I'm going to copy it and paste it over there. So now we have our three different colored highlights, primary, secondary, and tertiary, as well as the CSS class, which sets the structure for the highlight. And as I mentioned, we will be adding more properties to this. So let's now go add these classes to our spans. Back in our HTML, the text Mindful Living had the purple background color. That is our secondary color. So we'll go grab a class. We're first going to add the highlight class, which sets the structure. And then I'm going to add the specific color, which is Highlight Secondary. Moving down to the span over here, simple and easy, this had the orange background color. That is our tertiary color. So I'll get the class, again, add the structure of the highlight, which is the class highlight, and then add the specific color, which was highlight tertiary. So let's now check this out in the browser. All right, this has had a huge impact. You can see how great this is starting to look. We now have our purple background color applied to Mindful Living, and our tertiary orange color applied to Simple and Easy. The final thing we're going to do is add the primary blue background color to our call to action section. Now to do this, we actually will need to modify our HTML slightly. Let me show you why. In our CSS, I'm going to scroll down to the sections, and in the CTA section, we have this class CTA section. If you look at that in the HTML, that class is being applied to the semantic section element, which contains an H2, get started now, and the hyperlink. So let's add the primary blue background color inside this class. So I'll grab the background color property, and the value is just our base primary color, this one over here. So I'll copy that and paste it over here. So let's refresh, and this is looking good. But let me now show you the problem.
I'm now going to show you a new property we will be learning about in the next chapter.
However, I do need to add it now to show you the problem with our HTML. The property is height. So I'm going to add height, and I'm going to make the height of this element 300 pixels. And I'm going to refresh. So the problem that's happening is because the background color is being applied to the section, that is the entire section, it means the entire background color is going blue. And we don't actually want that. If you remember in our design, we have a card that is blue that is sitting on a white background. We don't want the entire section to be blue, just the card. So to handle this, what we need to do is go into our HTML and actually create a new div here to contain this content. So I'm going to cut the H2 and anchor tag and place them inside the div. And in the CSS, I'm now going to create a new class called CTA card and add the background color there. So I'll remove it from here and place it in CTA card. I'll then add this class to the div. So class CTA card. I'll save that and refresh. And this is what we want. We have our heading and hyperlink contained inside a card inside the section. Just to really highlight this, I'm going to open up DevTools. You can see the section is highlighted here, whereas the card is over here. Now, obviously, the card is positioned at the top, whereas in our design, it's centered, and we will be playing around with that later on. I'm just going to head back to app.css, and I'm going to remove the height, as I just added it there to show you the problem. So let's refresh, and we're actually back to where we started. However, we now have a div where the background color is being applied, so that when we do get to spacing this out, it will behave correctly, as we've contained the background color inside the card. Now, what we've just done is actually fairly common. When you start getting into the weeds of your CSS, you'll often need to go modify your HTML code to kind of further compartmentalize it and group content together more discreetly. So it's fairly common to have a base HTML file you're continually adding divs to make it work with your CSS. And we will be continuing to do this as we move through the CSS section.
Now, the last thing I wanted to mention before we finish this chapter is that in our design, we do have these outline buttons.
We will be styling those up in this topic. I just wanted to mention I haven't forgot about them,
and we will be handling them soon. Now we'll move on to explore how to control the dimensions of elements using width and height. We'll be discussing default block and inline element dimensions, the width and height property, and width and height design guidance. We'll start by talking about the CSS box model. Each rectangular box has height and width. For example, this image element over here has a width, in this case 630 pixels, and also a height, in this case 480 pixels. This heading has a width of 390 pixels and a height of 125 pixels. And the hyperlink down here has a width of 132 pixels and a height of 26 pixels. Inside DevTools, whenever you hover over an element, it shows you its dimensions. For example, this paragraph has a width of 483.9 pixels and a height of 90 pixels. You can see the dimensions are displayed on this pop-up in the top right corner. Now, block and inline elements have different default dimensions. Let's start by looking at the default block level element dimensions. By default, block level elements are just big enough to fit its contents vertically and stretches full width horizontally. Looking at some example markup, I have an H1 and paragraph. In the browser, these block elements will span the full width of the page, irrespective of which block element it is. Whether it's a heading or paragraph, it will span the full width of the page. So let's apply some CSS so we can look at the height. In this example, I'm applying a font size of 32 pixels to the H1 and a font size of 20 pixels to the paragraph. So these elements' height is set by the font size. So I've gone ahead and prepared this index.html file. It has the heading and paragraph we just saw previously. I've also added a style sheet where I've applied the font size of 32 pixels to the heading and the font size of 20 pixels to the paragraph. So let's check this out in the browser. Inside the browser, I'm going to go grab DevTools. I'm going to click on our heading, and you can see the blue box appears. For now, I just want to focus on the width. This heading has a width of 544 pixels, and the paragraph also has a width of 544 pixels. That is, they're both extending the full width of the page. The height of the heading is 37 pixels. So what's going on there? We would expect it to be 32 pixels. What's happening is that the browser has default line height properties. So if I go to our heading and just change the line height to 1 and refresh, you'll see that the height is now 32 pixels. And the same thing for the paragraph. It's currently got a height of 23 pixels. If I come and add line height of 1, its height, 20 pixels, now matches the font size. Continuing on our discussion of default block level element dimensions, I now want to look at container block level elements. I'm now going to wrap our H1 and paragraph with a div. So not only do individual elements span the full width of the page, but block element containers also span the full width of a page. And the height is the sum of font size and some margin. So jumping back into the index.html file, I'm going to go add a set of divs and nest the heading and paragraph inside of them. I'll then refresh the browser. I'll grab the inspector tool and grab the div. You can see the width, 518 pixels, extends the full width of the page. And the height, 73.44 pixels, is the sum of the font size of each element, as well as the space between the heading and the paragraph, which you can see in orange at the bottom. This is actually some default margin that has been applied to the heading and paragraph, which we'll be talking about later, and in fact removing. Let's now talk about the default inline level element dimensions. By default, inline level elements are just big enough to fit its contents both vertically and horizontally. Looking at some example HTML, in this case, I have an anchor tag and an image. I'll apply some font size to the anchor tag of 18 pixels. So for the anchor tag, the height and width are determined by the font size. And for the image, the height and width are determined by the image size itself. So like before, I've prepared this HTML file, which has an anchor tag as well as an image, which I'm just grabbing off the web using an absolute URL. For the styles, I've just applied a font size of 16 pixels to the anchor tag. Let's check this out in the browser. So let's open up DevTools and check out these elements. The anchor tag has a width of 66.2 pixels and a height of 18.33 pixels. Again, there's just some default line height being applied to make it a bit larger than the font size we set. For the image, it has a width of 800 pixels and a height of 543 pixels. This is just the size of the image itself. It's an image which is 800 pixels by 543 pixels. So let's now talk about the width and height properties. The default box dimensions can be overridden by the width and height properties. Over here we have width set as 500 pixels. Width is the property, and 500 pixels is the value. Over here we have height set at 100 pixels. Height is the property, and 100 pixels is the value. So this is how they're used. They can override default dimensions or set dimensions where none exist. So let's first look at what I mean by overriding default dimensions. I'm going to pop the CSS file on the right here. I'm going to grab our image, and I'm going to give it a width of 100 pixels. This is a lot smaller than the default width we saw earlier. So what we'll see is the image will shrink. This is an example of overriding the default dimensions, that is, the default size of the image. To show you an example of setting dimensions when none exist, I'm going to go add a set of divs. Now, a div is a container element. It wraps other elements. Now, if there are no elements inside a div, the div won't have any height or width. The height or width is set by the elements inside it. So in other words, there are no dimensions currently on the div. However, we can add these. I'll grab the div, I'll give it a width of 300 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. Just so we can see this, I'm going to give it a background color of blue. So you can see now that our image is a lot smaller. We've set the width at 100 pixels. And this div has a width of 300 pixels and 200 pixels. We've explicitly defined dimensions on it, where ordinarily none would exist. So let's now take a look at some guidance about how to use the width and height property. We'll first take a look at block level sizing guidance, and looking first at individual elements, such as heading, paragraphs, and lists. For height, we usually do not set height, but let it be automatically determined. Instead, margins, paddings, and font size determines the height. We saw this earlier when we used font size on the heading and paragraph. That set the height, and it's very uncommon to set the height using the height property on individual block elements. For the width, we usually do not set width, which will stretch to fill the parent container. For container elements, like divs and sections, and other semantic container elements, for the height, again, we usually do not set the height, but let it be automatically determined. And again, this will be a combination of margins, padding, and font size, which will be both applied to the individual elements inside the container and the container itself. For the width, depending on the layout, it can be common to set a width. And in a moment, we'll be looking at an example of this. This approach ensures flexibility where content better adapts to different screen sizes. So although you can set the height and width on any individual element or container element, it is actually common not to do it that often, except for the width of container elements. So let's have a look at what I mean. Looking at this web page here, we have these 3 card elements. I'm going to zoom into one of them. In red, I'm going to be showing our individual elements, and in orange, I'll be showing the container elements. So starting with the individual elements, we have a heading over here and some paragraph text over here. Looking at the width of this, the content stretches the full width of the container. So on these individual block elements, no width is being set. It just stretches the full width. For the height is being determined by the font size. So again, height is not being explicitly set. It's just being automatically calculated based on the font size. Looking now at the container element, which I've outlined in orange, the height is the sum of child elements and some padding. In other words, the height is calculated from the font size of the individual elements and some spacing between them. For the container element, the width is set. The card on the page is not extending the full width of the page. A width is manually being set to achieve this layout. Let's now take a look at some inline level sizing guidance. Width and height can be set on some inline elements, but not others. Later on in this topic, we will be talking a bit more about this. But for now, let's look at inline elements we can apply width and height. They include images, inputs, select, text area, and button. Now I do want to quickly talk about the image, because it is an element we're often applying width and height to. Setting width or height will adjust the other dimension automatically to preserve the aspect ratio. The aspect ratio is just a ratio between the width and height. So if you do adjust one property, like the width, the height will scale automatically, so the image isn't distorted. Let's now look at inline elements where you can't apply width and height. These include spans, anchor tags, subscript, and superscript. I want to quickly focus on the anchor tag, as this is something we commonly style. Now, although we can't add width and height, it is common to use padding to create space around the anchor text. And we will be doing this later on in this topic. I want to quickly show you what I meant about applying the width and height property on images. In the file we were working on earlier, we have this image over here. I'm going to head to the CSS file, and for now just comment out this styling on the image, and refresh. So this over here is the default size of the image. I'm going to uncomment it, and just make the width 300 pixels. So you can see that the overall size of the image has been reduced. Not only the width, but also the height. And the image is not distorted at all. This is what I mean by aspect ratio, and that when you apply one property, the other property automatically scales. If, however, I set an explicit height, say 50 pixels, you'll see how this image completely distorts. So behind the scenes, if you don't apply height, it is actually automatically being calculated so that the image does not distort. Now, just to show you an example of how we can't apply width and height to some inline elements like anchor tags, on our anchor tag here, I'm going to go add a width of 500 pixels and a height of 500 pixels. I'll give it some background color just so we can see it. And let's choose yellow. I'll refresh, and you can see the background color has been applied, but no width or height has been applied onto our inline element. As I mentioned earlier, it's actually more common to style anchor tags with padding as opposed to setting explicit width and height. But later on in this topic, we'll be discussing this in a lot more detail, and we will see a method which will allow us to apply width and height properties onto all inline elements. So let's now go add to our summary card the CSS box model. In this chapter, we looked at the width and height properties. The width property looked like this, which sets a fixed width on our element, and the height property looks like this, which sets a fixed height on our element. So let's now take a look at applying dimensions on the Quill homepage. We're first going to apply a width of 100 pixels to our logo in the navigation bar. For the buttons, we will apply padding later, as we don't use the width and height property on anchor tags. Scrolling down the page, for the images, we're going to set a width of 400 pixels. And at the bottom of the page, we're going to set a width of 1000 pixels on our call to action container. You can see this is totally in line with the guidance I provided earlier, where it is sometimes common to apply a set width on a block level container, whereas the height is determined by the content and some padding. So we're not going to be explicitly setting height here. And again, for the button, we will apply padding later. In the footer, the Quill logo, we're going to give a width of 80 pixels. And for each social media icon, we're going to give a width of 20 pixels. And as we just saw earlier, the height will automatically scale. So let's now jump into VS Code and add this all. I'm in the index.html file for our Quill application. Now, the first thing I need to actually do is remove some width I added back in the HTML section. If you're joining me for the first time now, and as a quick refresher, back in the HTML section, I actually used the HTML attribute width to set the width of some images. For example, each of the images in our features section has an HTML attribute width. I did this just to make our HTML more manageable, because some of the images were just huge and were just getting in the way. Now, you can set width like this, but it really is not common and is not best practice at all. Setting width and height in CSS is the way to go. So I'm just going to go remove all the widths I set. I set them on these feature images, and down in the footer, I also set them on each social media icon, because these did appear massive. So I'm just going to go remove them all now. Okay, so now we have our images all in their original size. And just to remind you how big some of these were, let's go check this out in the browser. So you can see these feature images are absolutely massive in their original size, and the social media icons are also huge. So let's go now take care of these with CSS. So the first thing I want to do is go create a new logo component. So I'm going to scroll down to our component section, and at the bottom here, I'm going to create a new class called logo MD, standing for medium. This will be the logo we'll use in the navigation bar. I'm going to set a width of 100 pixels. I'll also define another logo called logo-SM for small, and this will have a width of 80 pixels, and we'll be using this in the navigation bar. The reason I want to make these as components is that the logo could appear in many other locations throughout the web application, so they're reusable pieces of UI which we'd consider components. Let's go add these classes to our HTML. I'll pop the CSS on the right here. I'll scroll to the top, and we have our image over here nested inside an anchor tag. Inside the image tag, right at the start, I'm going to go add a class, logo-MD. I generally just like putting my classes right at the front. Let's also, while we're here, add the small logo class to the logo in the footer. So we have the image over here. I'll add a class, and this one is logo-SM for small. Next up, let's go handle the feature images. Now, those images aren't components, they're specific to the features section. So it's going to make more sense to add the styling rules in the features section. So I'm going to pop down here, add another class called feature-img for image, and we're going to set the width at 400 pixels. Let's go and add that class to our HTML. So for each image in the features section, I'm going to go add a class, of feature-img, and I'll just copy and paste that for each image. The final item we need to handle are the social media icons. Now those icons are going to be specific to the footer and won't be reusable, so it makes sense to do that in the footer section down here. I'm going to add a new class, social-icons, and we're going to set the width as 20 pixels. Let's go add that in our HTML. So for each social media icon, I'm going to pop here, add a class, which was social icons. I'm just going to copy and paste that for each icon. The last thing we need to do is add the width on our call to action card. We already have a class defined here, CTA card. So inside that class, I'm just going to go add the width, which we said was 1000 pixels. All right, so that's our work done. Let's go check it out in the browser. So let's work our way down to see the changes. I'm going to open up DevTools and hover over the icon. You can see its width is now 100 pixels, and the height is being automatically calculated according to the aspect ratio of the image. Scrolling down, each of the feature images are now 400 pixels wide, and again, because they're an image, the height is being automatically calculated. I'm going to zoom out a bit, just so that you can see the call to action does actually have a set width of 1000 pixels, and you can see it's not extending the full width of the page. There's some space on the right here. And the wider I make the browser, the more space that appears. There's a fixed width of 1000 pixels on this card. Now later on, we will be improving this by centering it, adding padding, and rounding the corners. You can see that the logo in the footer has a width of 80 pixels, which we set, and each of the social media icons now has a width of 20 pixels. Now it's time to see how to create space between an element's content and its border by looking at padding. We'll be looking at what is padding, the longhand and shorthand padding properties, and padding design guidance. So what is padding? Padding is the space between the content of an element and its border to improve readability and visual design. Looking back at the artwork I introduced at the start of this topic, on the far left, we have a Banksy painting. In terms of the CSS box model, the artwork itself is the content. The rose gold frame is the border, and the space between the content and the border is the padding. For the LeBron James poster, there's just content. There's no border and no padding. And for the serial plant killer poster, we have the content, which is surrounded by a white frame, or in box model terms, the border. So there's no padding on this poster. The poster is touching the frame directly. In other words, the content is touching the border, with no padding between it. Let's now look at an example web page of where padding is used. Focusing on the 3 cards towards the bottom of the page. Each of them have content. There's a very thin gray border. And in between the content and the border, there's some padding. Looking at the navigation bar in the top right, inside our buttons, the hyperlinked text is the content, and the filled color space surrounding the content is some padding. In this case, there actually is no defined border, but there appears to be a border, which is just a contrast of the background white color to the filled color of the buttons. So let's now take a look at the padding properties. I'm going to zoom in on one of these cards. We'll first be talking about the longhand padding property. This sets the padding on individual sides. Again, we have the content over here, and a very light gray border running along the perimeter of the card. At the top, the space between the content and the border is 5 pixels, and this would be defined like this: padding -top 5 pixels. On the right, the space between the content and the border is 10 pixels, and in CSS, we'd write this as padding -right 10 pixels. At the bottom, between the content and the border, there's also 5 pixels of padding, and in CSS, we would define it as padding -bottom 5 pixels. And finally, on the left, between the content and the border, there's 10 pixels of padding, and this would be defined as padding -left 10 pixels. Now you have complete freedom to set whatever values you want. It just so happens that for this card, the top and bottom values are the same, and the left and right values are the same. Alright, so let's jump into VS Code and play around with padding. I've created an index.html file, and I've also linked an app.css file. Inside the HTML file, I'm just going to go add some divs. Heading over to the CSS file, I'll select these divs, grab our curly brackets, and I'm going to give this div some dimensions. Let's give it a width of 500 pixels and a height of 500 pixels. Just so we can see it, I'm going to give it a background color, and let's choose something a bit more funky, like khaki. So let's see what this looks like in the browser. So inside the browser, we can see our khaki colored box. Let's open up DevTools and inspect the element. You can see it has a width and height of 500 pixels. Let's now go and add some padding. Let's start with padding top, and let's give it a value of 50 pixels. I'll refresh the browser, and now when I hover over it, you can see this green box appearing at the top. That's the additional padding of 50 pixels. Now, something you're going to be using a lot in the DevTools is at the bottom down here. This is the CSS box model. In the center is the dimensions of the content, 500 pixels by 500 pixels. The next layer out is the dimensions of the padding. In this case, there's just a 50 pixel padding at the top. The next layer out is the border, which currently has no values, and then the margin, which also has no values. The colors are also really important. You can see that when I hover over the content, it's blue, which matches the blue 500 by 500 pixels. And you can see at the top, the padding there is green, which matches the color in this model down here. Now, this is incredibly common to use, because often in your CSS, you'll want to understand why things are displayed the way they are. And looking at this box model is a simple visual representation of what's going on. Let's go add the other values now. We'll add a padding right of 20 pixels, a padding bottom of 40 pixels, and a padding left of 10 pixels. I'll refresh, and when I hover over it now, you can see the green box, which is the padding, is surrounding our element. If we look at the box model down here, we can see the values as well, 50, 20, 40, and 10. So now that we've had a look at the longhand padding, let's take a look at shorthand padding, which is actually more common to use. Shorthand padding sets the padding on all sides at once. There are 4 ways to use it. You can set all sides at once, like this, where a padding of 20 pixels will be applied to all 4 sides, top, right, bottom, and left. This approach is very common. The second way of using it is setting vertical and horizontal padding. It would look like this, where the first value, 10 pixels, is the vertical padding, so the top and bottom, and the second value, 20 pixels, is the horizontal padding, left and right. This method is also very common. The third way of using shorthand padding is setting it on the top, horizontal, and bottom. It looks like this, where we have 3 values. The first value is the top padding, the second value is the horizontal padding, left and right, and the third value is the bottom padding. Now, this one is quite uncommon, and to be honest, I find it a bit confusing to use. The fourth way of using the shorthand padding is setting values on each side. It looks like this. The first value is the top padding, the second value is the right padding, the third value is the bottom padding, and the fourth value is the left padding. The way to remember this is you start at the top and you work clockwise around the box. So top, right, bottom, and left. This one is kind of common. The reason is because there will be times you need to use it. But the truth is, most of the time you're using padding, you're using consistent values. Whether that's a consistent value all around the elements or consistent values vertically and horizontally. So let's play around with these in VS Code. I'm back in the file we were working with earlier. Let's go and style 2 anchor tags, which will act like buttons. I'll add 2 anchor tags. For the first anchor text, I'll make it register. And for the second anchor text, I'll make it login. Let's head over to the app.css file. I'll select these anchor tags. And first of all, I just want to give them a background color. And again, I'm going to choose a bit more of a funky color like salmon. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see down here, we have our 2 anchor tags. They appear next to each other because anchor tags are inline elements and they only take up the width of the content. So you can see the background color has been applied to the content. Let's go and add some padding now. I'm going to use the shorthand padding, so just padding, and I'm going to set values vertically and horizontally. Let's give this a vertical padding of 20 pixels, which is the first value, and a horizontal padding of 40 pixels, which sets the left and right padding. So let's refresh. So you can see padding has been added, and the background color still applies to the padding. So let's check these out in the DevTools. I'm going to inspect the register button, and look at the CSS box model. You can see that the width and height are auto. The reason for this is that the anchor element is not given an explicit height or width, but are being automatically calculated. So they do actually have a width and height. If I hover here, we can see it's 133.32 by 58.33. But from the box model perspective, they're just automatically being calculated based on the size of the anchor tag. You can also see the padding is applied. We have 20 top and bottom and 40 left and right. Now, one thing I do want to comment on, which we'll be talking about in a lot more detail later, is how these elements are kind of overlapping the div. Now, I wouldn't expect this behavior. It's not something we've seen before. Usually elements kind of have this force field around them. This weird thing going on here has to do with the fact these are inline elements, and padding just applies a bit weirdly to inline elements. We'll be talking about this soon, so don't worry about it now. I did just want to point it out in case you were wondering why we're getting this overlapping behavior. It is something we will be learning about and correcting in a few chapters' time. So let's now have a look at some padding guidance. Padding is commonly used in buttons and text callouts to improve readability. Let's have a look at this example here. I'm going to zoom in on this blue text callout. I'm going to cover the content in purple, and you can see the surrounding space is padding. Let's zoom in on these buttons at the bottom, and in a similar way, we have the anchor tag text in purple, and the surrounding fill color is made up of padding. This is incredibly common, using padding to improve readability on callouts and buttons. Padding is also commonly used on cards. Having a look at this example here, I'm going to zoom in on these 3 cards. I'm going to cover the content in purple, which would be grouped together in a container element like a div. You can see that there's this gray outline border, and the space between the content and the border is the padding. Padding is also commonly used on inputs. Looking at this page over here, on the right you can see an input to subscribe for the newsletter. Let's zoom in on that and have a look. The placeholder text, enter your email, is the content, which I'll cover up in purple. There's a gray border going around the input, and the space between the content and the border is the padding. So padding is commonly used to improve readability across several elements, specifically text callouts, buttons, cards, and inputs. So let's wrap up by adding to our summary card the CSS box model. In this chapter, we looked at padding. We first looked at the longhand padding properties, where we can set the padding on each side of the element, with padding top, padding right, padding bottom, and padding left. We then looked at the shorthand padding property, and we saw there were 4 possible options. We can set a single padding value, which applies to all 4 sides. We can set 2 padding values, where the first 10 pixels applies top and bottom, and the second 20 pixels applies left and right. We then saw a third option, where there's 3 values. The first value of 10 pixels sets the padding at the top, the second value of 20 pixels sets the padding left and right, and the third value of 5 pixels sets the padding at the bottom. The fourth shorthand property, which has 4 values, sets the padding on each individual side at once, starting at the top and moving clockwise, right, bottom, and left. We also discussed the most commonly used shorthand property are these first 2. So let's now go add padding on our Quill homepage. The first place we're going to add padding is on the text callout Mindful Living. The text Mindful Living is the content, and we have some additional space surrounding it, which is the padding. Looking now at the buttons in the center of the page, we have the text content Get Started and Learn More. You can see we also have a blue border going around this button, and the space around the content is the padding. Now we actually will be adding a blue border onto the main primary button. It's something we'll talk about a bit later, and we need to do it to ensure consistency between our buttons in different states. But I do just want to point out, we will actually be adding a border onto our primary button. Looking now at the buttons in the top right corner in the navigation bar, we have Login and Register, which is the content. Login has a border around it, and the Register button will also later have a border around it. And the space surrounding the content is the padding. Scrolling down the page, we're going to be adding padding to the text callout Simple and Easy. We have the text content, and the space surrounding it is the padding. Scrolling down to the bottom of the page, in the call to action section, we have the purple button Get Started. The Get Started text is the content, which is surrounded by some padding. The Get Started Now text and button are grouped together in a div, which we've previously given a width. So this is the content, and around the content we've added some padding to improve readability. Now, before we code this up in our project, I do briefly want to talk about why on this call to action card, we're adding padding as opposed to just defining a specific width and height. If you looked at this element just like this, you may think the right approach is just explicitly defining a width and height of this card. But this is not the correct approach. The correct approach is applying width to the container element, which we've done, letting the height be automatically calculated based on the individual elements, in this case, the heading and the button, and then adding padding around the div. Let's play around in VS Code so I can show you why this is the case. All right, so I'm back in the file we were working with earlier. I'm just going to remove all this markup and add a new set of divs. Inside the div, I'm just going to put a heading 2 of welcome to the app, and I'm going to add some paragraph text. I'm going to grab the standard lorem ipsum text and get 3 lots of it. All right, jumping to the app.css file, I'm going to remove all these styles. I'm going to reselect the div. Let's give it a width of 800 pixels. I'm not going to touch the height, as we know best practice, as we discussed earlier. It's common not to add explicit height of a container element, but rather let it be automatically calculated based on the height of the individual elements inside of it. Let's add a background color of khaki. I'm then also just going to center the text. I'll use text-align center, as this property is applied on the div and then inherited by the heading and paragraph. Let's jump into the browser and see what this looks like. All right, I'm just going to zoom out a bit so we can see what's going on. So let's first see what happens if I just add more width. Instead of 800 pixels, let's make it 1000 pixels. All that happens is the text stretches the full width now, and this doesn't look great. I'll change it back to 800 pixels. And as I mentioned before, it's very rare you want to set the height on a container element. You want the height to be determined by the individual elements of the heading and paragraph. So let's go add some padding. And as this is a card, it's common to set equal padding on every side. I'll set a padding value of 50 pixels. So you can see this massively improves the readability. There's now space going around the card. It's like height and width have been added, but the text remains in the center and there's space around it. The text isn't butting up against the edges. So this approach of adding padding to an element to increase its height and width is very common. All right, so I'm back inside our Quill project. Let's head over to app.css and go add padding to those 3 different locations. I'm going to scroll down to the components, and the first place we're going to add padding is on the button. I'm going to use the shorthand padding, and I'm going to use 2 values. The first value is for vertical padding, which I'm going to add 15 pixels. And the second value is for the horizontal padding, which will be applied left and right. Now, it is actually in fact quite common for padding on buttons to pick a vertical value and then double it horizontally. It's generally a good rule of thumb to do this. Now, just a comment, I'm adding padding to the button class because this is the class which sets up the structure of our buttons, whereas all these other versions are the different kinds of buttons, like primary and secondary, which mainly deal with colors. Let's scroll down to the highlight. And again, I'm going to apply the padding on our structural highlight class, because this padding is applied to every single highlight, irrespective of if it's a primary, secondary, or tertiary highlight. I'm going to grab the shorthand padding again, and again, I'll be setting 2 values. I'll set 5 pixels vertically, top and bottom, and I'll set 10 pixels horizontally, left and right. The last place we need to add padding is in our call to action section. We have this class CTA card, where currently with text aligning center, we've got the background color, and we've added a width of 1000 pixels. So let's go add our padding. And again, I'm going to be adding 2 separate values. I'll add 100 pixels vertically and 200 pixels horizontally. All right, so let's check this out in the browser. All right, this is starting to come to life now. You can see the padding has been added to the highlights, which has massively improved the readability. And also the padding has been applied to our primary buttons, also improving the readability. Don't worry for now that it's overlapping with the Learn More button. We're going to be styling this and taking care of it soon. Let's scroll down to the call to action section. So our CTA card is also looking great. The readability is improved and it really pops out a lot more by adding padding. And you can also see padding has been applied to the purple button, improving its readability. Now it's time to learn how to outline and define the edges of an element using the border property. We'll be discussing what is border, longhand and shorthand border properties, individual border properties, and border design guidance. So what is a border? A border creates a visible boundary around an HTML element and can enhance visual appearance and separation from other elements. We'll keep adding to the artwork analogy we've been using so far. On the frame picture on the left, the artwork itself is the content, the white space surrounding it is the padding, and then finally, the frame is the border. For the LeBron James poster, all we have is content. There's no padding or frame around it. For the artwork on the right, the poster is the content, and the frame directly touches the content. So we have a border surrounding the content. And in this case, there is no padding, so a border can touch the content directly, just like in this artwork. Let's look at how border is used on this web page. Over here, we have a border, which is separating the navigation from the main content of the page. On each of the cards, we also have a border, which is used to nicely contain the information of each card. So let's now look at longhand border properties. This sets the individual border properties and applies to all 4 borders. The first is width, which defines the border thickness. In CSS, it looks like this. The property is border-width, and the value in this example is 5 pixels. The default value of border width is 0 pixels, which means by default, every HTML element does not have a border because its width is 0 pixels. The values you can use include pixels, ems, and rems. Now don't worry about ems and rems, we'll be talking about them later. And in fact, pixels is the most common value to use in any case. The next border property is style. This defines the border line styles. In CSS, it looks like this. Border-style is the property, and in this example, the value is solid. The default value of border style is none, meaning that for every HTML element, not only is it 0 pixels, but there's no border style set. The possible values for border style include dotted, solid, dashed, and double. In just a bit, we'll be playing around in VS Code, so you can see how this all looks, but I'm sure you can imagine what a dotted line will look like. The final longhand border property is color, which as you can imagine sets the border color. In CSS, it looks like this. The property is border-color, and the value in this example is red. The default value is just the element color. So what I mean by this, if you were to set a border width and style but not a color, the color of the border will just be the same as the color of the element. So for example, if you had a green heading, the border would also be green. The values you can use for this are your typical color values like RGB and hex. So let's play around with this in VS Code. I've prepared an index.html file, as well as an empty style sheet called app.css. I'm going to add a div, and I'm just going to leave it empty. In app.css, I'm going to go select the div. Let's give it a width of 500 pixels and a height of 500 pixels. Let's also give it a background color, just so we can see it, of khaki. Let's now add our border properties. We'll first add border width, and let's give it a value of 10 pixels. Next, we'll add border style, and let's give this the value dotted. And for border color, let's just give this a value of black. All right, let's check this out in the browser. So you can see our khaki box, and we have a 10 pixel dotted black border. Let's check this out in the DevTools. I'll select the element and scroll down to the CSS box model here. You can see that the width and height of the div is 500 by 500. There's no padding, and the border is 10 pixels all the way around. And as I mentioned, it's dotted and black. Let's play around with the style. I'm going to change this to double. I'll refresh, and you can now see we have a double-lined border, which kind of looks like a frame. Now that we've had a look at the longhand border property, let's have a look at the shorthand border property. This sets all the border properties in one go and applies to all 4 borders. And this is in fact the more common approach. It looks like this. We have the property border, and then there's 3 values you can set. The first is the width, the second is the style, and the third is the color. It's just the 3 different properties we saw before, all merged into one single property. And as I mentioned, using this property is very common. So let's play around with it in VS Code. So let's just merge these 3 properties into one using the shorthand border property. I'll grab border, I'll give it a width of 10 pixels, a style of double, and a color of black. I'll remove these styles, I'll refresh, and you'll see there won't be any changes. I'm going to remove these just so we can play around with some other values. Let's set a border of 30 pixels, a style of dashed, and the color red. And you can see how this looks now in the browser. Using this shorthand property is by far the most common way of setting borders. It's incredibly compact and easy to use. Now, there's one more way you can set borders, and that's using individual border properties. This sets all the border properties in one go and applies to one border at a time. So it's just like the shorthand border property we just looked at. However, it only applies to one border at a time as opposed to all four at once. It looks like this. We have the border-top property with the same three values as before, border width, style, and color. And this border would look something like this. We then have border-right, and in this case, 2 pixels dashed blue, which would look something like this. The next property is border-bottom, and in this example, it's 1 pixel dotted red, which would look something like this. And the final property is border-left, which is 10 pixels double and green, which would look something like this. So let's play around with these border properties in VS Code. So for now, I'm just going to comment this out. Let's go add a border top of 10 pixels, solid and green, a border right of 20 pixels dashed and blue, a border bottom of 5 pixels dotted and red, and a border left of 30 pixels, double and purple. So you can see now the different styled borders on the 4 sides. So in summary, there are a few ways of setting borders. However, this one we saw earlier is the most common. It's not really that common to set individual borders, as usually we have a consistent border style that's applied to all 4 sides. So we use the shorthand border property, which is also the most compact. So let's now take a look at some border guidance. Borders help with grouping related content. For example, on this page, a border is used around the card. This piece of content is a testimonial, and the border is effective in grouping all the different elements together, like the logo, text, and image. Individual borders help separate sections. Looking at this example here, we have a border between the logos at the top, which is a section used to build trust, and the heading and images below, which looks like a feature section. So the border here is effective in creating a clear division between these two different sections. Borders can create outline buttons, which are commonly used alongside solid filled buttons. For example, on this page, you can see next to the Book a Demo button, which has a gray solid fill, we have over here an outline button. This button is almost the reverse of the filled button. Now I want to talk more about how the outline button is actually implemented, because when we add an outline button to our design, we actually need to make some modifications to the fill button to make the design consistent. It is common to add a border on a fill button which matches its background color when used alongside an outline button. So what do I mean by all this? Let's say we have a fill button that looks like this. The anchor text is Get Started and there's a blue background color. In the case of the outline button, it would actually look like this. Now I've purposely made the thickness of this border very large to emphasize the problem. You can see the Get Started outline button actually will appear larger than the filled button. So to make our buttons more visually consistent, border with the same background color is added. So we end up with a filled button that looks like this. And now the buttons will be consistent in height and width. So let me show you this inside VS Code. I'm back inside our index.html file. I'm going to add 2 anchor tags. I'll give the first one the anchor text filled, and the second one the anchor text outline. I'm just going to leave the href value empty, as I don't actually need these to link anywhere for this demonstration. What I will do is add some classes here, as we are going to style them in a sec. I'll give the first one a class of button filled, and I'll give the second one a class of button outline. So let's jump into the app.css file. I'm going to select the button filled first. I'll remove the text decoration. Let's give it a background color of blue, a font color of white, and padding of 20 pixels vertically and 40 pixels horizontally. Now I'm not going to add the border just yet because I want to show you the problem. On the button outline, I'm just going to copy these properties. I'm going to change the background color though to white because it's the opposite of our filled button, and the color here to blue. The button outline, I am going to add the border. So let's add a border of 10 pixels, solid and blue. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see here what I mean. The outline button has this blue border that goes around it and makes it appear much larger than the filled button. So to fix this, all we need to do is add the same border to the filled button. So I'm just going to copy this border and paste it here. Let's refresh, and you'll now see that our buttons are much more consistent in styling. Now again, just to point out, we do have that weird thing happening as we discussed earlier, where our buttons are kind of overlapping the div. Don't worry about that just yet, we will be talking about it soon. For now, I just want you to focus on this approach, where whenever you add an outline button, which is the opposite of the filled button, you have to go and add the same border onto it so that your buttons are consistent in their styles. So let's finish up by adding to our summary card the CSS box model. In this chapter, we looked at border. We first looked at the longhand border property, where we set the border width, border style, and border color independently. We then looked at the shorthand border property, where we're able to set the width, style, and color in one go. And we saw that this was the most commonly used border property. We also looked at setting individual borders, where we could set border top, border right, border bottom, and border left independently. So let's now go add border to the Quill homepage. We're going to be using border on our buttons. We're going to go define the outline button style, and then we're going to go add the same border to all our other buttons so that our buttons are consistent. So let's jump into VS Code. So I'm in our app.css file. I'm going to scroll down to the components section where we have our buttons. So just a reminder of how we're doing this. We're first defining a BTN class, which just sets up the structure of every single button, where these styles are the same across every button, like the font size, text decoration, and padding. We've then defined two different buttons, the primary button and secondary button. And for each of those, we've grouped together two separate states, link and visited as one state, and hover and active as the other state. So what I want to do is now go define a primary outline button. And I'm first going to do the link and visited states. We'll give this a class name of BTN, primary, and then outline. And the first pseudo class in this group is link. For the second class, I'm just going to copy this and change link to visited. I'll grab our curly brackets and let's define the specific styles of this button. So let's first add the text color. The text color is going to be the exact opposite of the values we have inside the button primary link and button primary visited. So all I'm going to do is grab the value we're using here for the background color, which will be the text color of the outline button. For the background color, again, it's the opposite. So on our primary filled button, we have a background color of this blue and a text color of this white, which means that the background color of our outline button will now be this white. I'm then going to add a border using the shorthand border property. We'll give it a thickness of 2 pixels. It will be solid, and the color will be the same as the text color. So I'll just copy this value and paste it there. So that's the first group of pseudo classes complete for our primary outline button, the link and visited pseudo classes. Let's now go add the other group of pseudo classes. I'm going to change link to hover and change visited to active. So just as a reminder, this is what happens when we hover over the button and click it. So for these colors, I'm now just going to do the opposite of what we have for our primary button for the hover and active pseudo classes. So on our primary filled button, the background color is this darker shade of blue. So that value will now become the color of our outline button. The background color will keep white. We don't want that to change. And for the border, we should update its color to be the same as the text color here. So I'll copy this value and paste it here. So we now have 3 different styles of buttons. We have our primary filled button, a primary outline button, and a secondary filled button. So before we check this out in the browser, we need to go add these classes in our HTML. So I'm going to pop over to index.html. Inside the navigation bar, we have the button login. So I'm going to add a class here. I'll first grab the BTN class, which sets up the structure of the button. And then I'll add the specific styling for the outline button, which is the class BTN primary outline. We then also have the outline button on the button learn more. So I'll just copy this class and paste it over here. So let's check out our work so far in the browser. All right, so this is looking really cool. We've now got our outline buttons next to our filled buttons. Now ignore the fact they're overlapping each other and not looking great. We'll sort that out in a bit. 2 things I want to comment on. The first is how the pseudo classes are working. When I hover over the button, you'll see it changes to a darker shade of blue, both the text learn more and the border. So that's working really nicely. The second comment is you can see the problem I've been speaking about. Because we're adding a border on this outline button, it's appearing visually inconsistent with the filled button. If I zoom in quite a bit, you can see it's just slightly wider, and that's because of the border being added onto the element. So let's go fix that now. To fix this, we need to add a border onto all our filled buttons. So let's start with the primary button. I'm just going to copy this border property here and paste it here. Now, we actually don't need to make any modifications to this. It's the same thickness and style as our outline button, and the color's also fine. The color needs to match the background color of our filled button. For the hover and active pseudo class of our primary button, I'm going to go copy this border here and paste it here. And again, we don't need to make any modifications. It's the same thickness and style as the outline hover and active pseudo class, and the background color matches the background color of the primary filled button. So all we're doing here is just adding on a little bit of border, which is the exact same as the background color of our primary filled button in its different pseudo classes, so that it appears visually consistent when next to the outline button. Now at the moment, we don't have a secondary outline button, so adding a border here is not totally necessary, but just to keep everything consistent, I am going to add the border, because we've done that on our primary filled button, and just in case we add a secondary outline button later on in the project. So let's go get the border property. It'll be the same thickness of 2 pixels, it will be solid, and the border color is just the same as the background color. For the hover and active pseudo class, we'll use the border property. It'll be the same thickness, the same style, and the color will be the same as the background color. So let's check this out in the browser. All right, this is looking much better. You can see our Learn More outline button is looking a lot more visually consistent with our filled button. And even though you can't notice it, there is in fact a border that's been applied onto the Get Started secondary button down here. Let's open up DevTools to have a look. I'm going to go select the button, and I'm going to scroll down here to the box model. You can see the padding here and that 2 pixel border. But to the naked eye, it just looks like some background color that's been applied to the padding. But in fact, we have padding and a border which is the same color in both states. You can see the link and visited state, and when I hover over, you can see the hover and active state, where again we have some padding with the shade of purple, and a border as well with that same shade of purple. It's now time to dive deeper into border by learning how we can add rounding to it with border radius. We'll be discussing the border radius property, how border radius works, hills and circles, and border radius design guidance. So what is border radius? Border radius rounds the corners of an element's border. So let's look at an example. In the top right corner of the Get Started button, you can see that there are rounded corners. And for the image on the left, there are also rounded corners. The border radius CSS property sets the border radius value. So border-radius is the property, and in this case, 12 pixels is the value. Values you can use include pixels, ems, rems, and percentages. Now, so far, we've only looked at pixels, and we will be talking about ems, rems, and percentages in the next topic. But it turns out for border radius, pixels is actually the most commonly used. Now, one thing that was never really taught to me is how border radius actually works. So I'd like to give you the experience I didn't have of having it explained properly to you. The way it works is a quarter circle is placed in the corner of an element, and the cutout rounds the element's corner. So let's say we had this rectangular element, and we set a border radius of 10 pixels. What's happening is that in each corner, a circle is placed like this. We then focus on the quarter circle that is in the corner, like this. The border radius value of 10 pixels is the radius of this circle. So this distance here is 10 pixels. This wedge over here, the space between the quarter circle and the corner of the element, is then cut out. So we're left with an element that looks like this, where rounding has happened on the corners. As another example, let's say we had the same element, but now applied a border radius of 20 pixels. The same thing happens. Circles are placed in the corner. We focus on a quarter circle. The radius is 20 pixels. And then the space between the quarter circle and corner of the element is cut out. And again, we can see rounding over here, where because the border radius is larger, there's more rounding. Let's play around with this in VS Code. I've got an empty index.html file, and I've already linked a style sheet, which is also empty. In index.html, I'm just going to create an empty div. In app.css, I'm going to select this div with the type selector. I'll give it a width of 500 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. Let's also give it a background color, and let's choose a bit more of an interesting color like plum. So this div will currently have square corners. So let's go around the corners by adding the border radius property. Let's give it a value of 20 pixels. All right, let's check it out in the browser. So here you can see our div, and the corners are now rounded. I'm just going to comment it out to show you what it would look like without rounded corners. Okay, I'm going to add it back in, and let's now increase the value significantly to see how it impacts the element. Let's change it to a value of 50 pixels. So you can see that the corners are now more rounded. Now there are two specific cases I want to look at when rounding corners. The first is called pills. Pills have fully rounded corners that are created from rectangles by setting border radius equal to half the element's height. So let's have a look at what I mean here. Let's say we have a rectangular element like this. Its width is 200 pixels, and its height is 100 pixels. So half the element's height would be 50 pixels. So we then set the border radius to be 50 pixels. Now because we're setting the border radius as half the height of the element, there are in fact only two circles inside this element now, not a circle in each corner. And instead of looking at quarter circles, we're now looking at semicircles, because the radius of each circle is 50 pixels. And again, we look at the space between the semicircle and the corners of the element, which is then cut out. And this leaves us with a shape that looks like this, a pill. Just like the pill you would take if you had a headache. You can see a pill has fully rounded corners. It's like a semicircle on each end. So let's play around with this in VS Code. So let's work in the file we were in before. We have a height of 200 pixels, so I'm now going to set the border radius to half the height, which would be 100 pixels. And let's see what this looks like. You can see now we get fully rounded corners. Now, just a small note, if I try to increase this value further, like 120 pixels, you'll see that there's actually no effect. The border radius kind of has a cap, which is half the height or width of the element, depending which one is smaller. The next special case I want to look at is circles. Circular elements are created from squares by setting border radius equal to half the element's height. So for circles, the element we're working from is not a rectangle, but a square. It's got an equal height and width. Let's say it's 100 pixels. Half the element's height, or width, because it's the same thing, would be 50 pixels. So if we set a border radius of 50 pixels, what this would mean is that there's one circle in the middle, which has a radius of 50 pixels. And then the same thing happens. The space between the circle and the element's corners is cut out, which leaves us with a perfect circle, which is fully rounded. So let's see this in VS Code. In our CSS file, I'm going to change the width to be 200 pixels. So now we'll have a square with a width and height of 200 pixels. Half the width and height would be 100 pixels, so I'm going to set the border radius to 100 pixels. And as you can see, this gives us a perfect circle. So let's now discuss border radius guidance. Square corners are more formal. We've seen this page previously, which sells pot plants at a premium. Because they want to come across as a more luxury brand, you can see that the corners are square corners. There's no rounding happening. Rounding corners can be perceived as more friendly. For example, on this page here, you can see the buttons have rounded corners, and it appears a bit less formal and a bit more friendly. Fully rounding corners can be perceived as playful. Taking a look at this page here, you can see the buttons have fully rounded corners, which fits this design really nicely. This design is very playful and colorful, and fully rounding the corners fits in nicely with this design. Now, it is important to have consistent rounding across all elements. So for example, you can see we have similar rounding on both the button and image. Now, the values actually used on the image and button would be different. You can see the image is much larger, so it would require a larger border radius value. But proportionally, they do have a similar rounding when looking at the page. So let's wrap up by adding to our summary card the CSS box model. In this chapter, we looked at border radius. We saw the property, which was border-radius, with a unit value. We saw that applying a border radius creates rounding on our corners. And we saw that half an element's height gives us fully rounded corners. So let's go and add border radius on the Quill homepage. In our highlights, we have rounding in the corners, and on all our buttons, we also have rounding. Scrolling down the page, you can see again in our highlight, we have rounding. And at the bottom of the page, our call to action box has rounding in the corners. And again, there's rounding on our buttons. So let's jump into VS Code and add border radius. So I'm back inside the Quill app.css file. I'm going to scroll down to the components, and I'm first going to add border radius to our BTN class. I'll grab the border radius property, and I'm going to give it a value of 8 pixels. There's no exact science to this, you just need to play around with values until you find one that looks right. And for me, that was 8 pixels. And just to make it super obvious, the reason I'm adding border radius onto the BTN class and not the specific buttons like primary, outline, or secondary is because border radius is part of the structure which will be seen on every single button. So it makes sense to add it here, along with the other properties like padding, etc. Let's scroll down to our highlight. And just like the BTN structural class, I'm going to go add the border radius here, which will be applied to all our highlights. And because this is a smaller component, I'm going to give it a border radius of 4 pixels. Again, it's a value I played around with that I thought looked nice. The final place we need to add border radius is on the call to action card. So I'm going to scroll down to the call to action section, and inside the CTA card class, I'm going to go add border radius. And because this is quite a large element, I'm going to choose a larger border radius of around 20 pixels, which again, I played around with earlier and it looked nice. Now, before we go and look at this in the browser, border radius is one of those properties we want to keep note of in our style guide. So I'm going to scroll to the top, and inside our style guide here, I'm just going to copy this heading. I'm going to come below the colors, and I'm going to add the heading border radius. And the values so far we've used are 4 pixels, 8 pixels, and 20 pixels. As the project expands, these are values we might want to pull from, or we might want to add some other values. But it's a good idea to keep track of the different border radius values that we're using. All right, so let's check this out in the browser. For me personally, border radius makes a massive difference to the visual impact of a design. The highlight element really looks nice with this slight border radius, and the buttons are really starting to take shape as well. Scrolling down, the call to action section also looks a bit more friendly with the corners rounded. Now let's dive into controlling how the box model calculates the size of elements using box sizing. We'll be discussing default box dimensions, the box sizing property, border box, and box sizing design guidance. So to get an understanding of box sizing, we need to get an understanding of the total box dimensions. By default, the total width and height of a box will be the sum of the content width and height, padding, and border. So let's have a look at an example of what I mean here. Let's say we had an element that looked like this, and the CSS rules were defined like this. You can see this element has a width of 500 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, a padding of 50 pixels, and a 10 pixel border. I'm going to illustrate each of these on our element. In purple, we have the actual content. From our CSS rule, this has a width of 500 pixels, some padding either side of 50 pixels, and the border width is 10 pixels. So the total width of our element would equal 2 lots of 10 pixels from the border, 2 lots of 50 pixels from the padding, and then the content width itself, which is 500 pixels. If we were to add this all together, we would get a total width of 620 pixels. Now, if I were to do the exact same thing for the height, we would get a total height of 10 pixels plus 50 pixels plus 200 pixels, plus 50 pixels, plus 10 pixels, which would give us a total height of 320 pixels. I'm going to call the total width and total height calculated values. They're calculated because I had to sum up the width and height with the respective padding and border. It's not so obvious just looking at the CSS to see instantaneously what the width and height of the element will be. It involves a bit of calculation. Now, it's not the most complex maths, but you do need to add up some values. Let's have a look at this in VS Code. All right, I've got an empty index.html file, and I've already hooked up a style sheet called app.css, which is currently empty. Inside the body, I'm just going to go and add an empty div. I'm going to give it a class called box1. Heading over to app.css, I'm going to select the class box1. I'll give it a width of 800 pixels, a height of 400 pixels. Let's give it a padding all the way around of 50 pixels and a border, which will make 10 pixels solid and black. Let's also give it a background color of plum so that we can easily see it in the browser. All right, let's check it out. So here are our boxes. I'm going to open up DevTools and I'm going to inspect the box. Scrolling down to the box model, you can see that the properties have been applied. 800 by 400, a 50 pixel padding all the way around, and a 10 pixel border all the way around. You can see that when I click the HTML here, it's showing the total dimensions, 920 by 520. Now the 920 is coming from the width of 800 plus 2 lots of 50 pixels for the padding left and right, which gets us to 900, plus 2 lots of 10 pixels for the border left and right, which gets us to 920 pixels. And the same thing for the height. The 520 pixels is coming from the height of 400 pixels, plus 2 times padding of 50 pixels, plus 2 times border of 10 pixels. So the takeaway point here is that by default, the dimensions of an element will be the sum of the width or height plus padding plus border. Now this behavior is actually defined in the CSS box sizing property. The box sizing property modifies how the total width and height of an element are calculated. It looks like this. Box-sizing is the property, and in this example, border-box is the value. The values we can have are content box or border box, where content box is the default value. And this is what we've seen so far, where the dimensions are calculated by adding the width and height, plus any padding, plus any border width. However, border box is the more commonly used value. So let's have a look at these in more detail. We'll start with content box, which is the default value, and is the behavior we've seen so far. If we set a width of 500 pixels, it means that the width of the content will be 500 pixels, and any padding and border is added on top of this. So the total dimensions is the sum of content, padding, and border. In this case, the set width and height will be smaller than the total width and height of the box. So what I mean by that is the width we're defining in our CSS property will always be smaller than the total width, because the total width will include the width as well as padding as well as border. I also want to highlight that the actual content dimensions are unchanged. The width of the content is always 500 pixels. So content box is the default behavior we've seen so far. Let's now talk about border box. For border box, if we set a width of 500 pixels, what this means, we'd actually end up getting something that looks like this, where now the total width is actually 500 pixels. That is, the content, padding, and border width all add up to 500 pixels. You can see when I add in these orange lines, the big difference between content box and border box. In content box, the width is just the width of the content. In border box, the width is the total width of the content, padding, and border. So in border box, the total dimensions include content, padding, and border. For border box, the set width and height will match the total width and height of the box. In border box, because the width includes content, padding, and border, it straight away is the total. So setting a width of 500 pixels in CSS will immediately give you the total width, which is very different to content box, which is being calculated, which is the sum of the content, padding, and border. Now, in order for border box to work, the content dimensions need to reduce. It's kind of like the content is getting squashed a bit because the width is now the total width, which needs to include the border width and the padding, which in a sense is kind of squashing the content so it all fits inside the set width. So now that we've compared content box and border box, let's look at the border box value in more detail. This is the setup we had at the start. Now I'm going to update the CSS to include the box sizing property with the value border box. Just as a reminder, the default value is content box, but I'm now changing this to border box. So by doing that, this is what will happen. The whole element will shrink. The width of 500 pixels, the set values of our width match the final box values. So the total width now is 500 pixels. So now we're going to work backwards. The total width is 500 pixels. The border is still 10 pixels, so we'll drag that up into our calculation. The padding is still 50 pixels, so we'll drag that up into our calculation. And for this to mathematically work, the width of the content has to be 380 pixels. So that when we sum this all up, we get a total width of 500 pixels. And I want to highlight that the content dimensions have reduced. Doing the same thing for the height, the calculation would look like this. total height equals 10 pixels, plus 50 pixels, plus 80 pixels, plus 50 pixels, plus 10 pixels equals 200 pixels, where again, the content dimensions have reduced. So before, the total width and height were called calculated values,